When a mid-level strategist locks eyes with his untouchable CEO at a wedding reception, he expects nothing more than polite acknowledgement. But when she leans close during the ceremony and whispers 5 words that shatter every professional boundary, "Stop looking at the bride. Look at me," everything changes. What follows is a dangerous dance between desire and consequence, where choosing each other means risking everything they've built. If you want to know whether love can survive when the whole company is watching, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wedding invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, cream-colored cardstock with elegant script that Ethan Walker almost threw away without opening. He didn't recognize the names immediately. College acquaintances he'd lost touch with years ago, the kind of peripheral friendships that survived only through annual holiday cards and occasional social media likes. But loneliness has a way of making even distant connections feel worth pursuing, so he RSVP'd yes and immediately regretted it. Now, standing in the lobby of the Harborview Estate with Lake Michigan stretching gray and restless beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Ethan questioned every decision that had brought him here. The venue was too elegant, the guests too polished, and his charcoal suit, perfectly acceptable for corporate meetings, suddenly felt inadequate among the sea of designer labels and confident sophistication that filled the space. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and increasingly aware that attending weddings alone was beginning to feel less like independence and more like evidence of some fundamental failing he couldn't quite name. "Ethan Walker?" He turned toward the voice, expecting one of the bride's cousins or perhaps a former classmate he'd forgotten. Instead, he found himself looking at Rachel Chen from the strategy department, her expression as surprised as his own. "Rachel, I didn't know you knew Amanda." "College roommate," Rachel said, gesturing with her champagne flute. "You?" "Study group sophomore year. We kept in touch, sort of." Ethan accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, grateful for something to do with his hands. "I'm honestly surprised I made the cut for the invitation list." Rachel laughed, a genuine sound that cut through the formal atmosphere. "Amanda invites everyone. I think her guest list topped 300. It's like a networking event disguised as a wedding." The observation was more accurate than Rachel probably intended. Ethan scanned the crowd, recognizing faces from various professional contexts, former colleagues, industry contacts, even a few executives from competing firms. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a carefully orchestrated social occasion where business cards were exchanged between toasts and career opportunities were whispered during cocktail hour. "Is anyone from Reynolds Tech here?" Ethan asked, naming their employer more out of conversational necessity than genuine curiosity. Reynolds Tech was a mid-sized technology company that had grown aggressively over the past 5 years, expanding from a scrappy startup into a legitimate industry player. Ethan worked in strategic planning, a role that sounded more impressive than it felt. He spent most of his time creating presentations that synthesized market research into actionable recommendations that senior leadership either implemented or ignored depending on quarterly revenue projections. Rachel's expression shifted slightly, a subtle change that Ethan couldn't quite interpret. "Actually, yes, Claire's here." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through Ethan's chest. Claire Reynolds, the CEO, the woman whose vision had built Reynolds Tech from nothing, whose strategic brilliance was profiled in business magazines, whose presence in any room seemed to shift the atmospheric pressure. "Claire Reynolds is here?" Ethan repeated, trying to keep his voice neutral. "At this wedding?" "Apparently Amanda's husband-to-be works with Claire's younger brother," Rachel explained. "Small world, right? I saw her earlier over by the terrace. She's wearing this incredible navy dress, very un-CEO-like. I almost didn't recognize her without the power suit." Ethan felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. In 3 years of working at Reynolds Tech, he'd been in the same room as Claire Reynolds perhaps a dozen times. Quarterly all-hands meetings, major presentations, one memorable emergency strategy session when a competitor launched a product that threatened their market position. Each encounter had been brief, professional, and completely devoid of personal connection. Claire Reynolds existed in a different stratosphere. She was 41 years old, brilliant, famously private, and treated corporate hierarchy like an impenetrable fortress. Executives jockeyed for 5 minutes of her time. Mid-level strategists like Ethan were lucky to receive an acknowledging nod in the hallway. The idea of encountering her here, outside the careful structure of office dynamics, felt fundamentally wrong. "I should probably say hello," Ethan heard himself say, though he had no intention of doing so. "Good luck," Rachel said, her tone suggesting she understood the absurdity of the statement. She's been pretty much keeping to herself. Very polite, very distant. Classic Claire Reynolds. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Guests were already drifting toward the main ballroom, following discreet signs and the gentle guidance of wedding coordinators in matching black dresses. Ethan decided to find his assigned seat early, avoid awkward small talk, and position himself somewhere Claire Reynolds was unlikely to notice him. The universe apparently had other plans. The seating chart was displayed on an enormous board near the ballroom entrance, table assignments written in flowing calligraphy. Ethan found his name quickly, table 12, somewhere in the middle distance, neither too close to the head table nor relegated to the social periphery. He was scanning for familiar names among his table mates when he saw it. Claire Reynolds, table 12. For a moment, Ethan considered the possibility that there were 2 Claire Reynolds attending this wedding. Perhaps the name was more common than he realized. Perhaps, "This is going to be interesting." The voice was familiar from conference calls and presentation feedback sessions, but hearing it this close, without the buffer of professional context, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Ethan's system. He turned and found Claire Reynolds standing beside him, close enough that he could see the faint lines around her eyes that suggested someone who smiled more than her corporate persona revealed, the subtle imperfection in her posture that made her seem suddenly impossibly human. She was shorter than he expected, 5'6" at most, though she carried herself with a presence that made height irrelevant. Rachel had been right about the dress. It was navy blue, elegantly simple, completely unlike the severe business attire Ethan associated with her office appearances. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, fell loose past her shoulders. Without the armor of executive presentation, she looked younger, softer, more accessible, and absolutely terrifying. "Ms. Reynolds," Ethan managed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I didn't expect—" "Neither did I," Claire interrupted, her tone carrying a hint of dry amusement. "And please, we're at a wedding. Claire is fine." The permission felt significant, like a door opening slightly in a previously locked room. Ethan nodded, trying to recalibrate every assumption he'd made about this encounter. "Ethan Walker," he said, though she clearly already knew. "Strategic planning." "I know who you are, Ethan." Claire's gaze was direct, unflinching. "You wrote the market positioning analysis for our Q3 expansion. Solid work. Clear thinking, minimal corporate jargon. I appreciate that." The compliment was delivered with such casual precision that Ethan almost missed its significance. Claire Reynolds had read his work, had remembered it, had formed an opinion strong enough to mention it at a wedding reception while they stood awkwardly before a seating chart. "Thank you," Ethan said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "That means a lot." "Don't let it go to your head," Claire replied, but there was a slight smile at the corner of her mouth, barely perceptible. "I've also read 17 other reports this quarter. You just happened to make the short list of material I didn't want to throw across the room." It was a joke. Claire Reynolds was making a joke. With him. At a wedding. Ethan felt something shift, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The woman standing beside him wasn't the untouchable CEO who commanded boardrooms and reshaped markets. She was someone wearing a dress she probably didn't wear often, attending a wedding for someone's brother, looking at a seating chart with the same mild resignation he felt. "Looks like we're table mates," Ethan observed, stating the obvious because he couldn't think of anything better to say. "Fate or random assignment," Claire said. "Either way, we should probably claim our seats before someone decides we're not actually supposed to be at table 12 and reassigns us to opposite corners of the room." They walked together toward the ballroom, not quite side by side, but close enough that Ethan was acutely aware of her presence. Other guests noticed. He saw heads turn, expressions shift, as people recognized Claire Reynolds moving through the crowd without her usual entourage of assistants and executives. Some looked curious, others looked calculating, already wondering what connection might be leveraged, what advantage might be gained from a casual conversation at a wedding reception. Claire seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, her expression pleasant but distant, the same measured demeanor she maintained during shareholder presentations. Table 12 was positioned with clear sightlines to the ceremony area, but far enough from the head table to avoid any obligations for interaction with the wedding party. It was a perfect placement for people who wanted to attend without being central to the celebration, polite observers rather than active participants. 6 other guests were already seated when Ethan and Claire arrived. Introductions were made with varying degrees of enthusiasm. A couple from Amanda's law firm, an elderly aunt who seemed confused about whose wedding this was, a young woman who worked in marketing and couldn't stop staring at Claire with barely concealed star-struck fascination. Ethan found himself seated directly beside Claire, their chairs close enough that he could detect the subtle scent of her perfume, something expensive and understated, not the aggressive designer fragrances that dominated corporate elevators. "So," said Derek, the lawyer from Amanda's firm, leaning forward with the aggressive friendliness of someone determined to network at every opportunity. "What do you all do besides attend weddings on beautiful Saturday afternoons?" The question was directed generally, but Derek's gaze lingered on Claire with unmistakable recognition. He knew exactly who she was. "I'm in technology," Claire said smoothly, offering nothing more. "Strategic leadership." It was technically accurate and completely unhelpful, a masterclass in providing information while revealing nothing. Ethan watched Derek's expression shift as he decided whether to push for details or accept the subtle boundary Claire had established. "Technology's such a broad field," Derek's wife, Jennifer, chimed in. "Software, hardware, consulting?" "A bit of everything," Claire replied, reaching for her water glass. "It keeps things interesting." Ethan felt an unexpected surge of admiration. Claire was being deliberately vague, not out of rudeness, but from what seemed like a genuine desire to avoid turning a wedding reception into a business development opportunity. She'd come here to be a guest, not a CEO, and she was protecting that boundary with the same strategic precision she applied to quarterly planning sessions. "What about you, Ethan?" Jennifer asked, turning her attention to him with what felt like relief at having someone potentially more forthcoming. "I work in strategic planning," Ethan said. "Market analysis, competitive positioning, nothing glamorous." "For what company?" Before Ethan could answer, Claire spoke. "Same company as me, actually. Small world." The statement landed with perfect timing, redirecting the conversation while establishing a connection that would make further interrogation awkward. Derek and Jennifer exchanged a glance, clearly recalculating their approach, then mercifully turned their attention to the marketing professional who seemed eager to discuss her recent campaign launch. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, leaning slightly toward Claire. "I wasn't sure how to handle that without either lying or making things weird." "People at weddings always want to talk about work," Claire replied, her voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "It's safer than discussing relationships or politics. But sometimes you just want to eat overpriced chicken and watch 2 people promise forever without conducting business development." The observation was so unexpectedly honest that Ethan found himself smiling. "Is that what we're doing? Eating overpriced chicken and avoiding business development?" "That's my plan," Claire said. "What's yours?" The question felt significant, weighted with implications Ethan couldn't fully process. What was his plan? He'd come to this wedding because loneliness had made an obligation feel like an opportunity. He'd expected to feel awkward and out of place, to leave early with a headache and the renewed conviction that weddings were designed for coupled people who enjoyed public displays of commitment. He hadn't expected to be sitting beside Claire Reynolds, having the most genuine conversation he'd had in months. "My plan is to not embarrass myself," Ethan said honestly. "So far, I'm cautiously optimistic." Claire's smile was barely visible, but it was real. "You're doing fine, Ethan. Better than fine, actually. You haven't tried to pitch me a project idea or ask about job opportunities. That puts you ahead of approximately 90% of people who recognize me outside the office." "Is that what usually happens?" "Without fail. I can't go to the grocery store without someone asking about our hiring timeline or suggesting I invest in their startup idea." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Claire admitted. "Which is why I almost didn't come today. I knew people would recognize me. I knew conversations would turn into networking opportunities disguised as small talk. But Amanda's fiancé is my brother's best friend, and family obligations have weight. Even for CEOs? Especially for CEOs. We're not allowed to be selfish with our time, apparently. The ceremony began before Ethan could respond. The lights dimmed slightly, music swelled from hidden speakers, and the crowd settled into expectant silence. Ethan watched as the wedding party processed down the aisle with practiced precision, bridesmaids in dusty rows, groomsmen in charcoal suits, a flower girl who dropped petals with solemn concentration. Then Amanda appeared at the far end of the aisle, beautiful in white lace, her father's arm steady beside her. The crowd rose in unison, the traditional gesture of respect and celebration. Ethan stood with everyone else, his attention drawn to the bride's expression as she walked toward her future husband. There was something powerful about watching someone choose, publicly and irrevocably, to bind their life to another person. It was terrifying and brave and completely inexplicable to Ethan's analytical mind. How did anyone become that certain? That willing to risk everything on the belief that love would be enough? He was so focused on Amanda's steady progression that he didn't notice Claire's movement until her hand brushed his arm, light and deliberate. He turned slightly, expecting her to need something, more space, a different angle to see the ceremony. Instead, Claire leaned close, her mouth near his ear, her voice quiet but absolutely clear. "Stop looking at the bride. Look at me." The words hit like a physical force. Ethan's breath caught, his entire body suddenly hyper-aware of Claire's proximity, the warmth of her breath against his skin, the deliberate intimacy of the moment. He turned his head slowly, carefully, until he was facing Claire instead of the ceremony. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held something Ethan couldn't quite name: intensity, vulnerability, a question she wasn't asking aloud. The rest of the ballroom faded. The music, the bride, the assembled guests, all of it became background noise against the singular focus of Claire Reynolds, looking at him with an expression that shattered every professional boundary they'd maintained. "Why?" Ethan whispered, the word barely audible. Claire didn't answer immediately. She held his gaze, unflinching, as though the question required consideration rather than automatic response. Finally, she spoke. "Because I wanted you to." It wasn't an explanation. It was something more dangerous, an acknowledgement that what was happening between them transcended coincidence and polite conversation. Claire Reynolds, untouchable CEO, had just made a choice, and that choice involved Ethan. The ceremony continued around them. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and the courage required to choose another person. But Ethan heard none of it. He was entirely focused on the woman beside him, on the way her expression had shifted from careful control to something raw and unguarded. When the ceremony concluded and the couple kissed to thunderous applause, Ethan and Claire were still looking at each other. "We should probably sit down," Claire said eventually, her voice steady despite the chaos Ethan felt certain was mirroring his own. "Probably," Ethan agreed. But neither of them moved. The reception that followed was a blur of standard wedding rituals, toasts and first dances and dinner courses that appeared and disappeared with clockwork precision. Ethan participated automatically, laughing at appropriate moments, applauding when expected, maintaining conversation with their table mates about topics he'd forget immediately. But his attention never fully left Claire. They didn't speak much during dinner, didn't acknowledge what had happened during the ceremony. To any observer, they were simply colleagues seated beside each other by random assignment, politely coexisting through a social obligation. But there was an awareness now, a charged space between them that Ethan felt with every breath. Claire was careful with her wine, taking small sips but never finishing her glass. She answered questions directed at her with practiced deflection, sharing just enough to be polite without revealing anything meaningful. She was performing, Ethan realized, executing the social requirements of wedding attendance while keeping herself completely protected. Except when she looked at him. Those moments were different, brief, intense, completely unguarded. Claire would glance sideways, catch his eye, and for 2 seconds the performance would drop. Ethan would see something real, curiosity, uncertainty, desire, before the mask returned and Claire turned back to whatever conversation demanded her attention. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. When dinner concluded and the dance floor opened, Their table mates dispersed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Derek and Jennifer claimed they needed to greet the bride. The elderly aunt was escorted away by a patient nephew. The marketing professional disappeared toward the bar. Ethan and Claire remained seated alone at table 12 while celebration continued around them. "I should probably leave," Claire said, but she didn't stand. "I've fulfilled my obligation. Made an appearance, ate the chicken, stayed through the toasts. No one would judge me for leaving early." "But you're not leaving," Ethan observed. "No," Claire agreed, "I'm not." "Why not?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the stem of her wine glass with unconscious precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Ethan had ever heard it. "Because I don't want to. Because sitting here with you feels more real than anything I've done in months. Because pretending I don't notice you is exhausting, and I'm tired of pretending." The confession was delivered without drama, stated like a simple fact that required acknowledgement rather than discussion. Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "You've noticed me?" "For 6 months," Claire said. "Since that emergency strategy meeting about the Vertex product launch. You were the only person in the room who admitted we didn't have enough data to make a confident recommendation. Everyone else was performing certainty they didn't feel, but you just told the truth. Even though it made you vulnerable, even though it would have been easier to pretend." Ethan remembered that meeting, remembered the sick feeling of speaking up when everyone else seemed confident, remembered Claire's sharp gaze landing on him, her expression unreadable. He'd thought she was judging him. Apparently she'd been noticing him. "I thought you were angry," Ethan admitted. "I was impressed," Claire corrected. "Honesty is rare, especially from people who have something to lose." "What am I supposed to do with that information?" Claire finally looked at him fully. No performance, no careful control. Just a woman looking at a man with an expression that held both invitation and warning. "That depends on what you want, Ethan." The question hung between them, impossible to ignore. What did he want? Safety? To stand up, thank Claire for the conversation, and return to their normal dynamic of CEO and mid-level strategist? To pretend this wedding had been nothing more than a coincidence that would fade into anecdote? Or did he want something reckless and dangerous? To acknowledge this pull between them, to explore what it might mean, to risk everything for the possibility of something real? "I want to not forget this," Ethan said finally. "Whatever this is, I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Claire's expression shifted, relief perhaps, or recognition. "Then we have a problem, because forgetting would be safer, for both of us." "I know. There's a power imbalance. My position, your position. It creates complications that could damage both our careers." "I know," Ethan repeated. "People would assume things, make judgments, reduce whatever this is to something calculating or inappropriate." "I know." Claire leaned back in her chair, her composure returning like armor sliding back into place, but her eyes remained soft, uncertain in a way Ethan suspected few people ever witnessed. "So what do we do?" she asked. Ethan stood, offering his hand with a formality that felt absurdly inadequate for the moment. "We start with a dance, and then we figure out the rest." Claire looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing consequences Ethan couldn't fully imagine. Then she placed her hand in his, her grip steady and sure, and let him help her stand. The dance floor was crowded with couples moving to a slow song Ethan didn't recognize. He led Claire to a space near the edge, away from the center spotlight, and pulled her into a standard ballroom hold that felt simultaneously too formal and too intimate. "I'm not a great dancer," Ethan warned. "I'm willing to risk it," Claire replied. They moved together, awkward at first, finding a rhythm that worked despite Ethan's limited skills. Claire was light in his arms, responsive to his lead even when he stumbled. Up close, Ethan could see details he'd never noticed before: the faint scar near her left temple, the constellation of freckles across her collarbone, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating. "This is a terrible idea," Claire said quietly, the words vibrating against Ethan's chest. "Probably," Ethan agreed. "We should stop, before this becomes something we can't walk away from." "We should." Neither of them moved to separate. The song ended, replaced by something faster and more upbeat that sent couples spinning with renewed energy. Ethan and Claire stood still, hands still connected, the space between them charged with everything they weren't saying. "Come outside with me," Claire said. It wasn't quite a request, wasn't quite a command. "Just for a few minutes. I need air." They left through a side door that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the lake. The temperature had dropped with sunset, cold October wind cutting through Ethan's suit jacket. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly, but didn't suggest going back inside. They were alone out here. The terrace was empty, illuminated only by landscape lights that cast long shadows across weathered stone. Beyond the low wall, Lake Michigan stretched dark and infinite toward an invisible horizon. "I almost didn't come today," Claire said, her voice carrying over the wind. "I had a perfectly good excuse. Board presentation to prepare, quarterly reviews to complete. But my brother guilted me into it, said I needed to do something normal for once. Stop being the CEO and just be a person." "Are you? A person, I mean. Or are you always the CEO?" Claire's laugh was hollow. "I don't know anymore. The role consumes everything if you let it. Work becomes identity. Strategy becomes personality. And before you realize it, you've forgotten how to exist without the performance." "Is this a performance?" Ethan asked, gesturing between them. "Right now?" "No," Claire said immediately. "This is the least performative I've been in years, which is why it's so dangerous." Ethan moved closer, drawn by a gravity he couldn't resist. "Why is it dangerous to be real?" "Because real means vulnerable, and vulnerability means risk. And risk means—" Claire trailed off, shaking her head. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're explaining it perfectly." Claire turned to face him fully, her back against the terrace wall, her expression open in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. "I noticed you 6 months ago," she said, "and I've been noticing you ever since. Every presentation you give, every email you send, every time you walk past my office, I notice. And it's been getting harder to pretend I don't." "Why pretend at all?" "Because I'm the CEO, Ethan. Because anything between us would be scrutinized and judged. Because people would assume you're using me for advancement or I'm taking advantage of my position. Because the simplest explanation is usually the ugliest one, and we'd have to live with those assumptions every day." "What if I don't care about any of that?" Ethan asked. "Then you're not thinking clearly." "Maybe not," Ethan admitted, "but I'm also not willing to walk away just because something is complicated." Claire studied him with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever this is, attraction, connection, temporary insanity, I want to explore it. Carefully. Honestly. Without pretending it's nothing just because acknowledging it is risky. That's remarkably clear thinking for someone who claims to not be thinking clearly." "I have my moments." Claire was quiet for a long time, the wind pulling strands of dark hair across her face. She looked younger out here, away from boardrooms and quarterly presentations, not diminished, just human. "If we do this," she said finally, "it has to be separate from work. Completely separate. No special treatment, no favoritism, no appearance of impropriety." "Agreed. And if it becomes complicated, if the risk outweighs the possibility, we end it, cleanly, no drama, no resentment." "Okay. I'm serious, Ethan. I won't let this destroy what I've built, not for anyone." "I'm not asking you to." Claire searched his face, looking for something she apparently found. Then we moved forward, carefully. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise. It was simply an acknowledgement that they were choosing to see what happened next, despite every logical reason to walk away. Ethan reached for Claire's hand, threading his fingers through hers with a tenderness that felt disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. She didn't pull away. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ethan admitted. "Neither do I," Claire said, "but I'm tired of pretending I don't want to find out." They stood together on the terrace while the wedding continued inside. Two people beginning something that felt both inevitable and impossible. The wind shifted, carrying music and laughter from the reception, reminding them that the world continued despite their private revolution. Eventually, they would have to return inside, face their table mates, maintain professional distance, pretend nothing significant had happened. But for now, they stayed outside in the cold, hands joined, looking out at the dark water and the unknown future spreading before them like an unwritten story. Inside, the bride and groom cut their cake to enthusiastic applause. Someone made a toast about forever. The DJ announced the last dance. But Ethan and Claire remained on the terrace, choosing each other over safety, beginning something they both knew would change everything. The Monday morning after the wedding arrived with the inevitability of consequence. Ethan sat in his car in the Reynolds Tech parking garage for 7 full minutes before forcing himself to walk through the glass doors into the lobby. Everything looked exactly as it had the previous Friday. Same security desk, same polished floors, same corporate motivational posters about innovation and excellence. But Ethan felt fundamentally altered, like he'd returned from the wedding as a different person occupying the same life. He texted Claire once on Sunday evening, a simple message that had taken him 20 minutes to compose. "Thank you for Saturday. I meant everything I said." She'd responded 3 hours later with equal brevity. "So did I. See you Monday." Now Monday had arrived, and Ethan had no idea what seeing Claire would actually mean. The strategy department occupied the 3rd floor, an open-plan workspace designed to encourage collaboration, but mostly succeeding in destroying any illusion of privacy. Ethan's desk was positioned near the window, offering a view of the parking lot, and more importantly, a direct sightline to the elevator bank where senior executives arrived each morning. He booted up his computer and tried to focus on the quarterly competitive analysis due by end of week. The data was straightforward: market share projections, pricing strategies, feature comparisons, but his concentration kept fragmenting, his attention drawn repeatedly to the elevator doors. Claire arrived at 8:45, emerging from the executive elevator with her usual entourage of assistants and department heads. She wore a charcoal suit that erased any trace of the woman in the navy dress, her hair pulled back severely, her expression focused and impenetrable. She didn't glance toward the strategy department, didn't acknowledge Ethan's existence even peripherally. It was exactly what they'd agreed to. Complete separation between whatever was developing personally and their professional obligations. But watching Claire walk past without recognition felt like a small violence, a denial of Saturday night that made Ethan question whether any of it had actually happened. "You okay?" Rachel appeared beside his desk, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of concerned curiosity. "You look like you saw a ghost." "Just tired," Ethan lied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Wedding hangover. Please tell me you got drunk and embarrassed yourself so I have something to look forward to hearing about." "Sorry to disappoint, I was remarkably well behaved." Rachel settled into the chair beside his desk, clearly in no hurry to return to her own work. "I saw you talking with Claire Reynolds. That must have been surreal. What's she like outside the office?" The question was innocent, casual workplace gossip with no awareness of the minefield it represented. Ethan took a careful sip of coffee, buying himself time to formulate a response that was honest without being revealing. "Professional," he said finally. "We talked about work mostly. Nothing particularly interesting." "That's disappointing. I was hoping she'd have some secret personality we never see, like maybe she's secretly hilarious or collects vintage comic books or something." "If she does, she didn't share it with me." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper. "You're being weird. You're never this evasive about anything." "I'm not being evasive, I just don't have anything interesting to report." "Right." Rachel clearly didn't believe him, but she was kind enough not to push. "Well, if you need to talk about whatever's making you weird, I'm available. Just say the word." She left with a backward glance that suggested the conversation was far from over. Ethan returned his attention to his computer screen, but the numbers and projections felt meaningless against the larger question consuming his thoughts. What happened now? The answer came 3 hours later in the form of an email from Claire's executive assistant. "Ms. Reynolds requests your presence at a 2 p.m. meeting to discuss Q4 strategic initiatives, Conference Room B. Please bring your competitive analysis materials." It was a perfectly professional request. Nothing unusual about a CEO wanting to review strategic planning with a mid-level analyst. Except Ethan's competitive analysis wasn't due until Friday, and Claire had 17 other people she could have requested for this review. He spent the intervening hours in a state of controlled anxiety, rehearsing professional talking points while his mind raced through every possible scenario. Maybe this was Claire's way of establishing normalcy. Maybe she'd realized Saturday was a mistake and wanted to reset boundaries. Maybe... At 1:55, Ethan gathered his materials and walked toward conference room B with a deliberate calm he absolutely didn't feel. The conference room was smaller than the main boardroom, designed for intimate strategy sessions rather than large presentations. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown, and the afternoon sunlight created geometric patterns across the polished table. Claire was already there, standing by the window with her back to the door, her posture rigid with tension that matched Ethan's own. "Close the door," she said without turning around. Ethan obeyed, the soft click of the latch somehow final and significant. Claire turned to face him, and Ethan saw immediately that the CEO persona had cracked slightly. Her expression wasn't quite as controlled as it had been in the hallway, her eyes holding something uncertain and human. "This is harder than I expected," Claire said without preamble. "Seeing you this morning and pretending Saturday didn't happen, acting like you're just another employee." "I know," Ethan replied. "I felt it too. I've been doing this for 12 years, building walls between personal and professional, never letting anyone close enough to matter. And it's worked. It's kept things simple, kept me focused." Claire moved away from the window, closer to where Ethan stood. "But now I can't stop thinking about you. And that's a problem." "Why is it a problem?" "Because thinking about you means I'm distracted during presentations. I'm rereading emails you send looking for subtext that probably isn't there. I'm scheduling unnecessary meetings just to have an excuse to see you. And that's not who I am. That's not how I operate." Ethan set his materials down on the conference table, buying himself a moment to process. "So what do you want to do about it?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, and the honesty in her voice was almost painful. "Part of me wants to end this before it becomes more complicated. Tell you Saturday was a moment of weakness we both need to forget. Return to our professional relationship and pretend none of this happened." "And the other part?" Claire closed the remaining distance between them, standing close enough that Ethan could see the fine lines around her eyes, the slight imperfection in her lipstick application, all the small details that made her real rather than iconic. "The other part wants to see where this goes," she said quietly. "Wants to risk the complications because the alternative, pretending I don't feel this, seems worse than any professional consequence." "Then let's see where it goes." "It's not that simple, Ethan. There are rules. HR policies about relationships between executives and subordinates. Disclosure requirements. Mandatory reassignments if the relationship creates conflicts of interest. So we follow the rules. And if the rules require one of us to leave the company?" The question hung heavy between them. Ethan hadn't considered that possibility, that choosing Claire might mean choosing to abandon the career he'd been building, the stability he'd fought for. "We'll deal with that if it happens," Ethan said, with more confidence than he felt. "But right now I'm more concerned about what we're doing than what might happen later." Claire's expression softened. "So you make it sound simple." "Maybe it is simple. We like each other. We want to explore that. Everything else is just logistics. Logistics that could destroy both our careers? Or logistics we navigate carefully because what we're building is worth the effort." Claire reached out, her hand finding Ethan's with a tentative touch that felt almost shy. "I haven't done this in a long time. Dating, I mean. Being vulnerable with someone. It's terrifying." "You don't have to be terrifying CEO right now," Ethan said. "You can just be Claire. The woman who whispered something dangerous during a wedding ceremony and changed everything." A ghost of a smile crossed Claire's face. That was reckless. That was brave. Or stupid. Sometimes those are the same thing. Claire's phone buzzed on the conference table, a reminder that the world beyond this room continued regardless of their private conversation. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting back toward professional control. "I have a board call in 10 minutes, she said. "And you probably have actual work that doesn't involve standing in a conference room having an existential crisis with your CEO." "This feels like important work," Ethan countered. "It does," Claire agreed. "But we still need to figure out how to do this without destroying everything else." "Dinner," Ethan said suddenly. "Let me take you to dinner. Somewhere away from the office, away from anyone who might recognize us. Just two people getting to know each other." Claire considered the proposal, weighing risks Ethan could only imagine. Finally, she nodded. Thursday night. I'll text you an address. Somewhere quiet. Thursday, Ethan confirmed. Claire picked up her phone, her professional armor sliding back into place with practiced ease. But before she left, she paused at the door and looked back at him with an expression that held both promise and warning. This changes everything, Ethan. You understand that, right? I do. And you're still willing? I am. Claire nodded once, then left the conference room with the same purposeful stride she'd used entering the building that morning. To anyone watching, it was just another executive departing another meeting. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth noticing. But Ethan stood alone in conference room B, feeling like the ground beneath him had fundamentally shifted, like he'd just committed to something that would either be the best decision of his life or the most catastrophic mistake. The rest of the week passed in a strange duality. Professionally, nothing changed. Ethan completed his competitive analysis, attended his scheduled meetings, collaborated with colleagues on routine projects. But underneath the normal rhythms of work, he was acutely aware of Claire's presence in the building, her schedule, her movements, the moments when they passed in hallways and maintained perfect professional distance while everything inside Ethan screamed recognition. They didn't speak directly until Wednesday afternoon, when Claire sent an email to the entire strategy department requesting updated market projections for an investor presentation. Buried in the third paragraph was a single sentence that appeared completely innocuous to anyone else. Ethan, please include your restaurant analysis in the competitive landscape section. Ethan had never written a restaurant analysis. The sentence was meant only for him, a confirmation that Thursday's dinner was still happening. He replied to the department-wide email with his own coded message. We'll include comprehensive restaurant analysis as requested. Looking forward to the presentation. It was absurd and juvenile and absolutely necessary. They were like teenagers passing notes in class, finding ways to communicate while maintaining the appearance of complete professionalism. Rachel noticed something was different. She didn't ask directly, but her glances became more frequent, her questions more pointed. On Wednesday afternoon, she cornered Ethan by the coffee machine with an expression that suggested she'd connected dots he'd hoped remained separate. You're seeing someone, Rachel said flatly. Don't deny it. You've got that look. What look? The look people get when they're thinking about someone they shouldn't be thinking about. Distracted but happy. Anxious but excited. Rachel leaned closer, lowering her voice. Is it someone from work? I'm not discussing my personal life, Ethan said, trying for firm boundaries and probably failing. That's a yes. Oh my God, Ethan, that's so unlike you. You're the most risk-averse person I know. Maybe I'm tired of being risk-averse. Rachel studied him with a mixture of concern and fascination. Just be careful, okay? Office relationships get messy, especially if there's any kind of power imbalance. The observation was too close to reality. Ethan forced himself to meet Rachel's gaze with false confidence. I know what I'm doing. I hope so, Rachel said, but her expression suggested she had serious doubts. Thursday arrived with agonizing slowness. Ethan left work at his normal time, drove home to his apartment, and spent 40 minutes deciding what to wear for a dinner that was simultaneously a first date and potentially the beginning of something that could reshape his entire life. He settled on dark jeans and a button-down shirt, casual enough to not seem like he was trying too hard, but polished enough to show effort. Then he sat on his couch and stared at his phone, waiting for Claire's text with the restaurant address. It arrived at 6:45. Lucia's 7:30, small Italian place on Randolph. Private booths, see you there. Ethan arrived 15 minutes early and waited in his car, watching the restaurant entrance with nervous energy that felt disproportionate to the situation. This was just dinner. Just two people having a meal together. Nothing momentous or life-changing. Except it absolutely was. Claire arrived at exactly 7:30, pulling up in a nondescript sedan that was nothing like the sleek executive vehicle Ethan associated with her professional life. She'd changed from her work clothes into dark slacks and a cream sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and nervous, and completely unlike the untouchable CEO who commanded boardrooms. Ethan got out of his car and met her on the sidewalk. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the awkwardness of transition between work colleagues and something more hanging between them like a question neither knew how to answer. Hi, Claire said finally. Hi, Ethan replied. This is weird, isn't it? Incredibly weird. Claire smiled, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. Good, I was worried it was just me. Lucia's was exactly as advertised. A small Italian restaurant with dim lighting, high-backed booths that offered genuine privacy, and the kind of intimate atmosphere that suggested the owners understood their clientele valued discretion. The hostess led them to a corner booth without comment, provided menus, and disappeared with professional efficiency. Ethan and Claire sat across from each other, the table between them both barrier and bridge. I almost canceled 3 times today, Claire admitted, fidgeting with her napkin. Came up with perfectly reasonable excuses. Emergency board meeting, last-minute investor call, sudden onset plague. What stopped you? The realization that I wanted to be here more than I wanted to protect myself, which is terrifying, honestly. We can still leave, Ethan offered. Walk away right now. Go back to being just colleagues. Do you want that? No, Ethan said honestly. But I want you to feel safe. Claire's expression softened. I don't think I've felt truly safe in years, but I feel honest right now, and that's something. They ordered wine and pasta, making small talk about neutral topics while they calibrated this new dynamic. Claire asked about Ethan's background, where he grew up, what led him to strategy work, whether he'd always been this thoughtful or if it was a learned skill. Ethan answered honestly, sharing details about his middle-class upbringing in Ohio, his business degree from a state university, his slow climb up the corporate ladder through competence rather than connections. It wasn't a dramatic story. No rags to riches narrative or against all odds triumph, just the ordinary path of someone who worked hard and hoped it would be enough. What about you? Ethan asked when the conversation naturally shifted. How does someone become Claire Reynolds, CEO? Claire took a slow sip of wine, considering her response. The same way anyone becomes anything. A combination of preparation, opportunity, and refusing to accept limitations other people tried to impose. That sounds like a rehearsed answer. It is, Claire admitted. I've given versions of that response in probably 50 interviews. The real answer is more complicated and less inspiring. I want the real answer. Claire was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the stem of her wine glass with unconscious precision. I started Reynolds Tech because I was angry. I'd spent 10 years in corporate environments being told I was too aggressive, too direct, too unwilling to play politics. I got passed over for promotions in favor of less qualified men who knew how to perform confidence without actually delivering results. And I got tired of fighting systems that were designed to keep me in my place. So you built your own system. I built something better, Claire corrected. A company where competence mattered more than performance, where strategic thinking was valued over corporate theater, where people could be direct without being penalized for it. She paused, her expression turning wry. Of course, building that company required me to become exactly the kind of controlled strategic performer I'd hated in my previous roles. The irony isn't lost on me. You don't seem like a performer to me. That's because you're seeing me without the armor. Most people don't get that privilege. Why do I? Claire met his gaze directly, unflinching. Because when you spoke up in that emergency meeting 6 months ago, you reminded me why I built this company in the first place. You told the truth even when it made you vulnerable. You prioritized accuracy over self-preservation, and I thought that's what I wanted to create, people who care more about being right than looking right. And now you're having dinner with me. And now I'm having dinner with you, Claire confirmed, which is either the best decision I've made in years or a catastrophic lapse in judgment. Time will tell. Their food arrived, interrupting the conversation, but not the underlying current of connection flowing between them. They ate and talked, the conversation moving easily from professional philosophy to personal preferences, favorite books, worst travel experiences, the specific kind of exhaustion that came from pretending to be fine when you weren't. Claire was funny, Ethan discovered, not in an obvious way, but with a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly, catching him off guard and making him laugh in ways that felt genuine and unguarded. I can't remember the last time I did this, Claire said as dessert arrived, tiramisu they'd agreed to share, despite both claiming to be too full. Just sat and talked with someone without an agenda, without strategy or purpose beyond enjoying the conversation. How does it feel? Strange, wonderful, slightly terrifying. Claire took a small bite of tiramisu, her expression thoughtful. I've built my entire adult life around control, controlling outcomes, controlling perceptions, controlling my own emotional responses. And sitting here with you, I feel completely out of control, like I'm free-falling without knowing where I'll land. Is that a bad thing? I don't know yet, Claire said honestly. Ask me when we land. They stayed at the restaurant until the staff began dimming lights and setting chairs on tables, subtle indicators that closing time had arrived. Ethan paid the bill over Claire's mild protests, and they walked out into the cold October night with no clear plan for what happened next. I parked around the corner, Claire said, gesturing vaguely toward a side street. I'll walk you, Ethan offered. They walked slowly, neither eager for the evening to end. The street was quiet. Most businesses already closed, the downtown area settling into that strange emptiness that comes after business hours, but before late-night crowds emerge. When they reached Claire's car, she turned to face him with an expression that held both certainty and question. I want to see you again, she said, not just in conference rooms and hallways. Actually see you, is that something you want? Yes, Ethan replied without hesitation. Even knowing all the complications? The risks? Especially knowing the complications and risks. Claire stepped closer, closing the distance between them until Ethan could feel the warmth of her breath in the cold air. Then we do this carefully. We keep work separate. We don't give anyone reason to question our professionalism, and we figure out how to build something real without destroying everything else. Agreed. Claire rose onto her toes and kissed him, a brief touch of lips that held both promise and restraint. When she pulled back, her expression was softer than Ethan had ever seen it. Thank you for tonight, she said quietly, for making me feel like a person instead of a position. You are a person, Claire. An extraordinary one. Keep saying things like that and I might start believing you. She got into her car with a final backward glance that held everything they weren't yet ready to say aloud. Ethan watched her drive away, then stood alone on the empty street, feeling like his entire life had just pivoted towards something uncertain and wonderful and terrifying. He drove home in a daze, replaying the evening, analyzing every word and gesture like a strategic analysis. By the time he reached his apartment, one thing had become absolutely clear. This was no longer about attraction or curiosity. This was about Claire Reynolds, brilliant, guarded, unexpectedly vulnerable Claire, and the possibility that choosing her might mean choosing to rebuild his entire life around something fragile and unprecedented and completely worth the risk. His phone buzzed as he unlocked his apartment door. A text from Claire. Made it home safely. Already looking forward to next time. Ethan smiled and typed his response. So am I. The next 3 weeks unfolded in a careful choreography of separation and connection that tested every assumption Ethan held about what relationships could look like. At work, he and Claire maintained perfect professional distance. She was still the untouchable CEO. He was still the mid-level strategist whose opinions mattered only within the narrow scope of his department. They passed each other in hallways without acknowledgement beyond polite nods. They attended the same meetings without sitting near each other or exchanging glances that might suggest familiarity beyond corporate hierarchy. But outside the office, they were building something that felt increasingly real and increasingly impossible to contain. They met for dinner twice more, always at quiet restaurants in neighborhoods where Reynolds Tech employees were unlikely to frequent. They discovered shared preferences, both hated pretentious wine culture, both loved old movies with terrible special effects, both found comfort in thunderstorms that other people dreaded. Claire talked about the loneliness of leadership, how success had created distance from everyone who might have been friends if circumstances were different. Ethan shared his own isolation, the way climbing corporate ladders meant leaving behind the people who'd known him before ambition became identity. On their fourth date, Claire invited him to her apartment, a carefully neutral suggestion delivered with the caveat that they could still leave if things felt wrong. The apartment was in a high-rise downtown, all clean lines and expensive furniture that looked rarely used, like a hotel suite occupied by someone who never quite settled in. Claire poured wine with shaking hands and admitted she couldn't remember the last time she'd invited someone into her personal space. They sat on her couch talking until 2 in the morning, the conversation moving from careful to confessional as the hours passed. Claire told him about her failed engagement 10 years earlier, how she'd chosen the company over a man who couldn't accept that her career would always demand equal priority. Ethan shared his own romantic failures, relationships that had dissolved under the weight of mutual indifference disguised as compatibility. When he finally kissed her properly, not the brief contact from their first date, but something deeper and more honest, Claire responded with an intensity that suggested she'd been holding back for weeks. They moved to her bedroom with the awkward navigation of people learning each other's rhythms, and what followed was tender and uncertain and absolutely right in ways that defied Ethan's ability to articulate. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Claire's head resting against his chest, Ethan felt the full weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't casual. This wasn't something that could be compartmentalized or controlled. This was real connection forming in the worst possible circumstances, and the collision between what they wanted and what they could safely sustain was inevitable. "We can't keep this secret forever," Claire said quietly, her voice carrying through the darkness. "Eventually someone will notice. Someone always notices." "I know," Ethan replied, his hand moving absently through her hair. "And when they notice, there will be consequences. HR investigations, forced reassignments, possibly one of us losing our job." "I know that too." Claire lifted her head to look at him, her expression serious despite the intimacy of their position. "Are you prepared for that? Really prepared? Because I need you to understand what you're risking." Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "I understand that being with you might cost me my career. I understand that people will make assumptions about why we're together. I understand all of it, and I'm still here." "Why?" The question was simple but carried enormous weight. Why was Ethan willing to risk everything for a relationship that was barely a month old, with a woman whose position made them fundamentally unequal in professional terms? "Because you make me feel seen," Ethan said finally. "Not as a role or a position, but as a person. Because when I'm with you, I remember why I wanted to do meaningful work in the first place, not to climb ladders or accumulate titles, but to be part of something real. And because pretending this doesn't matter seems like the worst kind of cowardice." Claire's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me or the most naive. Can it be both?" "I suppose it can." Claire settled back against him, her breathing evening out as exhaustion finally claimed her. "We'll figure it out, somehow. We have to." But figuring it out proved more complicated than either of them anticipated. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in late November when Ethan arrived at work to find Rachel waiting by his desk with an expression that combined concern and barely contained excitement. "We need to talk," Rachel said without preamble. "Conference room. Now." Ethan followed her to an empty meeting space, his stomach already churning with the certainty that whatever Rachel wanted to discuss would be both unavoidable and uncomfortable. Rachel closed the door and turned to face him with her arms crossed. "You're sleeping with Claire Reynolds." It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with absolute confidence, and Ethan's immediate impulse to deny it died before reaching his lips. Rachel knew. Somehow, despite all their precautions, she knew. "How did you—" "I saw you," Rachel interrupted, "last Thursday night. I was having drinks with friends at that wine bar on State Street, and I saw you and Claire walking together. You were holding hands, Ethan, and the way you looked at each other—" She shook her head. "I've known you for 3 years. I've never seen you look at anyone like that." Ethan felt his carefully constructed separation between personal and professional collapse into rubble. "Rachel, I can explain. You don't need to explain. I'm not judging you. But you need to understand how dangerous this is. Claire Reynolds is the CEO. You're a mid-level employee. The power dynamics alone make this a massive HR violation. And if anyone else finds out before you've properly disclosed the relationship, you could both be fired." "We've been careful," Ethan said weakly. "Clearly not careful enough if I spotted you after one evening of drinks." Rachel's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not going to say anything. Your personal life is your business. But you need to get ahead of this. Talk to HR. Establish proper protocols. Because right now, you're both vulnerable in ways you probably haven't fully considered. She was right, and Ethan knew it. The careful compartmentalization he and Claire had maintained was an illusion, sustainable only until the first person noticed, and then impossible to defend. I'll talk to Claire, Ethan said. We'll figure out what to do. Do it soon, Rachel advised, because secrets like this don't stay secret, and the longer you wait, the worse the fallout will be. Ethan texted Claire immediately after Rachel left, a simple message that conveyed urgency without details. We need to talk, tonight. Important. Her response came 30 minutes later. My place, 7 p.m. The workday passed in agonizing slow motion. Ethan tried to focus on his assignments but kept circling back to Rachel's warning and the implications of exposure. They'd been so careful about public spaces, about maintaining distance at work, about never giving anyone reason to suspect, but careful wasn't enough when one chance sighting could unravel everything. Claire opened her apartment door looking exhausted, still wearing her work clothes, her hair escaping from its usual severe arrangement. What happened? Ethan stepped inside and delivered the news without preamble. Rachel saw us last Thursday. She knows we're together. Claire's face went pale, her composure cracking visibly. Did she say anything to anyone else? No, she came to me directly, warned me about the risks, told me we need to disclose to HR before someone else does. She's right. Claire moved to her couch and sat heavily, her professional armor completely abandoned. This was inevitable. I knew it was inevitable. I just hoped we'd have more time. Ethan sat beside her, taking her hand with a gentleness that felt inadequate for the moment. So what do we do? We disclose, Claire said flatly. Tomorrow. We go to HR together and formally acknowledge the relationship. They'll conduct an investigation to ensure there's no favoritism or conflicts of interest. And then they'll likely recommend reassignment for one of us. Reassignment where? Different department, different reporting structure. Somewhere that eliminates the direct power imbalance. Claire's voice was steady, but her hand trembled in Ethan's grip. The board will probably insist on it. They'll frame it as protecting the company from liability, but what they're really doing is protecting themselves from the appearance of impropriety. And if we refuse? Then one of us gets terminated. Probably me, despite being the CEO. The board can vote to remove me if they believe my judgment is compromised, or if I'm creating legal exposure for the company. The reality of what they faced settled over them like a weight. This wasn't just about inconvenience or temporary complications. This was about fundamental threats to everything they'd individually built. Claire's company, Ethan's career, the professional identities they'd both spent years constructing. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. I never meant for this to put you in danger. Claire turned to look at him, her expression fierce despite the fear Ethan could see beneath it. Don't apologize for this. Don't apologize for us. We both made choices. We both knew the risks, and I would make the same choices again. Even knowing it might cost you the company? Even then. Claire moved closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face with startling tenderness. I've spent 12 years building Reynolds Tech. It's my legacy, my proof that I could create something better than the systems that tried to limit me. But it's also become my prison. And you, being with you, you remind me that I'm more than just what I've built. That I'm allowed to want things that have nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market positioning. What if we lose everything? Then we lose everything. But at least we'll lose it together, making choices we can live with rather than sacrifices that slowly destroy us from the inside. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands joined, facing an uncertain future with nothing but each other and a determination to not let fear make their decisions for them. Tomorrow morning, Claire said finally, 9 a.m., we'll go to HR together and disclose everything. No hiding, no minimizing. Complete transparency about the relationship and the timeline. And then we deal with whatever comes next. And then we deal with whatever comes next, Claire agreed. That night, Ethan stayed at Claire's apartment, and they talked until dawn about possibilities and contingencies. If Claire was forced out as CEO, she had enough savings to survive comfortably while deciding her next move. If Ethan was reassigned or terminated, his skills were transferable to other companies. They weren't helpless. They weren't without options. But the prospect of losing what they'd built, both individually and together, was terrifying in ways neither wanted to fully acknowledge. When morning arrived, they dressed in silence, the weight of what they were about to do hanging between them like a physical presence. Claire wore her most severe business suit, armor for a battle she couldn't avoid. Ethan chose clothes that projected competence and seriousness, though he doubted his wardrobe choices would matter in the slightest. They drove to the office separately, maintaining the illusion of professional distance one final time. Ethan arrived first and waited in the parking garage, watching for Claire's car with a mixture of dread and determination. She pulled in at 8:45, emerging from her vehicle with the same controlled composure she always displayed at work. But when she saw Ethan waiting, her expression softened momentarily, a brief acknowledgement of shared purpose before the performance resumed. They walked into the building together, side by side, no longer hiding. Several employees noticed, expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity as Claire Reynolds and a mid-level strategist crossed the lobby in obvious coordination. The HR department occupied a suite on the fourth floor, deliberately positioned away from main work areas to provide privacy for difficult conversations. Claire and Ethan entered together, and the receptionist's eyes widened slightly before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "We need to speak with Director Morrison," Claire said calmly. "It's urgent." Sarah Morrison was Reynolds Tech's HR director, a woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for fairness and discretion. She emerged from her office within minutes, her expression carefully neutral as she took in the unusual pairing of CEO and employee requesting an emergency meeting. "Of course," Sarah said. "Please, come in." Her office was designed for difficult conversations. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, a tissue box positioned within easy reach. Sarah gestured for them to sit, then settled behind her desk with the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible workplace confession. "What can I help you with today?" Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she'd already formed suspicions. Claire sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, every inch the professional executive, even as she prepared to disclose information that could destroy her position. "Ethan Walker and I are in a personal relationship. We're here to formally disclose that relationship and request guidance on appropriate next steps." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw her shoulders tense slightly. "I see. How long has this relationship been ongoing?" "Approximately 6 weeks," Claire replied. "We met outside of work at a wedding reception and began seeing each other personally shortly after. We've maintained complete professional boundaries at the office and have ensured that there's been no favoritism or special treatment in work matters. Has there been any exchange of benefits, promotions, assignments, access to confidential information?" "No," Ethan interjected. "Our relationship has been entirely separate from work. I haven't received any preferential treatment, and Claire hasn't shared any information with me that isn't already available to other employees at my level." Sarah made notes on a legal pad, her expression unreadable. "You understand that relationships between executives and subordinate employees create potential conflicts of interest and expose the company to liability concerns?" "We do," Claire said, "which is why we're disclosing now, before the relationship becomes known through other channels. We want to be transparent and work within company policies to address any concerns." "The company policy is clear," Sarah said, her tone sympathetic but firm. "Romantic relationships between employees with direct or indirect reporting relationships must be disclosed immediately. Once disclosed, the company conducts an investigation to determine if any conflicts of interest exist or if any policies have been violated. Following the investigation, remedial actions are typically recommended to eliminate the power imbalance." "Remedial actions meaning reassignment," Claire stated rather than asked. "Typically, yes. One party would need to be moved to a different department or reporting structure that eliminates the supervisory relationship." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "And if that's not possible? If there's no comparable position available?" Sarah's expression became genuinely sympathetic. "Then we explore other options. Voluntary departure with appropriate severance. Transfer to a subsidiary or partner company. In extreme cases, termination if the conflict cannot be resolved, and the employee refuses other remedies. The clinical language couldn't disguise the brutal reality. One of them would have to leave. There was no scenario where both Claire and Ethan kept their current positions and continued their relationship. "How long does the investigation typically take?" Claire asked. 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the complexity. We'll need to interview both of you separately, review any relevant communications or interactions, and assess whether any policies have been violated. Sarah paused, then added quietly, "Ms. Reynolds, I need to inform you that the board will be notified of this disclosure. Given your position as CEO, they'll want to be involved in determining appropriate remedies." Claire's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand. Is there anything else you need to disclose at this time?" "No," Claire said. "We've been completely transparent about the nature and duration of the relationship." Sarah nodded, making a final note. "Then I'll begin the formal investigation process today. You'll each receive interview requests within the next 48 hours. In the meantime, I strongly recommend maintaining professional distance at work and refraining from any interactions that could be perceived as favoritism." They were being dismissed. Ethan and Claire stood simultaneously, and Sarah walked them to the door with the careful courtesy of someone managing an explosive situation. "For what it's worth," Sarah said quietly as they prepared to leave, "I appreciate your transparency. Many people in your position would have tried to hide the relationship until forced to disclose. Coming forward voluntarily demonstrates integrity." "Thank you," Claire replied, though her expression suggested the compliment provided little comfort. They left HR together and rode the elevator down in heavy silence. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, Ethan's floor, Claire finally spoke. "Go to work," she said softly. "Try to maintain normalcy. We knew this was coming." "What are you going to do?" "Call the board chair. Get ahead of the notification from HR. Start preparing for whatever fight comes next." Claire's expression was resolute, her CEO armor fully restored. "This isn't over, Ethan. We disclose, we comply with the investigation, and we figure out how to survive whatever they decide." "Together?" "Together," Claire confirmed. Ethan stepped out of the elevator and the doors closed between them with a finality that felt symbolic. He walked to his desk in a daze, aware of curious glances from colleagues who'd noticed his arrival with Claire, who sensed something significant had occurred. Rachel appeared within minutes, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You talked to HR?" "This morning. They're starting an investigation." "Good. That's good. It's the right thing to do." Rachel lowered her voice. "How's Claire handling it?" "Like she handles everything, with perfect control and absolute determination." "And you?" Ethan sank into his desk chair, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. "I'm terrified, and I have no idea what happens next. But I don't regret anything." "Even if you lose your job?" "Even then." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then smiled sadly. "You really love her, don't you?" The question caught Ethan off guard. Love? They'd been dating for 6 weeks. They barely knew each other's daily routines, favorite foods, childhood traumas. Love seemed like an enormous word for something so new and uncertain. But looking back at the elevator where Claire had disappeared, remembering her steady presence beside him in HR, her determination to fight for what they'd built together, Ethan realized the answer was simpler than the question suggested. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do." The investigation began that afternoon with efficiency that suggested HR had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Ethan received his first interview request within 3 hours, a formal calendar invitation for Thursday morning with Sarah Morrison and a corporate attorney whose presence indicated the seriousness of the inquiry. The interview was clinical and thorough. Sarah asked about the timeline of the relationship, the nature of their interactions at work, whether Ethan had ever received special treatment or access to information he wouldn't otherwise have. The attorney took notes and occasionally interjected with clarifying questions designed to identify potential policy violations or legal exposure. Ethan answered honestly, walking them through the wedding reception, the dinner dates, the careful separation between personal and professional. He admitted the relationship was serious, that he cared deeply for Claire, that they discussed long-term possibilities despite knowing the complications. Has Ms. Reynolds ever used her position to benefit you professionally? The attorney asked. No, if anything, she's been more careful with me than with other employees. She avoids assigning me to projects she's directly involved with. She never shares confidential information. We've maintained complete separation. But you acknowledge the relationship creates an appearance of impropriety regardless of actual favoritism? Yes, Ethan admitted. I understand that perception matters as much as reality in these situations. The interview lasted 90 minutes and left Ethan feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every moment he'd shared with Claire was now subject to corporate scrutiny, reduced to potential policy violations and liability concerns. The love he'd acknowledged to Rachel was being examined like a business risk, quantified and assessed for its potential to damage the company. Claire's interview, he later learned, had been even more intensive. The board had sent 2 members to participate, concerned about the optics of their CEO engaging in a relationship with a subordinate. They'd pressed her on judgment on whether the relationship compromised her ability to lead effectively, on whether keeping it private for 6 weeks constituted a deception that undermined trust. They want me to end it, Claire told Ethan that evening when they met at her apartment, the first time they'd been alone since the HR disclosure. The board chair was very clear. They're concerned about the company's reputation, about potential lawsuits from other employees claiming favoritism, about my ability to maintain objectivity. What did you tell them? That my personal life is my own business as long as I don't violate company policy or compromise my professional responsibilities. That I disclose the relationship appropriately and have maintained proper boundaries. That they don't get to dictate who I care about just because it creates inconvenience for them. Ethan felt a surge of admiration for Claire's defiance, even as fear tightened his chest. And how did they respond? They reminded me that I serve at their pleasure, that if they lose confidence in my leadership, they can vote to remove me as CEO. Claire's voice was steady, but Ethan could see the strain in her expression. They're going to wait for the HR investigation results. If there's any evidence of impropriety, any suggestion that I've given you preferential treatment or violated policy, they'll use it as justification for my removal. And if the investigation finds nothing wrong, then they'll pressure me to choose the company or you. They won't say it explicitly, but the message will be clear. Having a relationship with an employee, even if technically permissible after reassignment, demonstrates poor judgment that undermines my credibility as CEO. Ethan moved to where Claire stood by the window, her silhouette dark against the city lights beyond. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself rigid against vulnerability. I won't let you lose your company because of me, Ethan said quietly. If it comes down to choosing, I'll walk away, find another job, remove the conflict entirely. Claire turned in his arms, her expression fierce. And I won't let you sacrifice your career because the board is too concerned with optics to recognize that people are allowed to be complicated, that leaders are allowed to have personal lives, that caring about someone doesn't automatically compromise professional integrity. So what do? We wait for the investigation to conclude. We hope it finds what we know to be true, that we've done nothing wrong except fall for each other. And if the board tries to force a choice anyway, we make them face the reality that their policies prioritize appearance over substance. It sounded brave and principled, but Ethan heard the uncertainty beneath Claire's determination. She was facing the possibility of losing everything she'd built, and no amount of righteous conviction could eliminate that fear. I love you, Ethan said, the words emerging with startling clarity. I know it's fast and probably naive and not strategic at all, but I love you. And whatever happens, I need you to know that. Claire's eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother hiding. I love you too, which is why this is so terrifying, because I finally found someone who makes me feel human again, and the cost of keeping you might be everything else I've built. Then we find a way to have both, or we build something new, but we do it together. They held each other in the gathering darkness, 2 people caught between what they wanted and what the world insisted they were allowed to have, making promises neither could guarantee but both desperately needed to believe. The investigation lasted exactly 17 days, though to Ethan, it felt like 17 years compressed into a nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. Every morning he arrived at work wondering if this would be the day HR delivered their verdict. Every afternoon, Claire sent him brief, carefully worded texts that provided updates without revealing anything that could later be used against them. The board had assigned outside counsel to review the investigation findings. Sarah Morrison was being thorough to the point of obsession, interviewing not just Ethan and Claire, but colleagues who might have witnessed their interactions, analyzing email patterns for evidence of favoritism, reviewing every project assignment Ethan had received since the relationship began. The scrutiny was suffocating. Ethan felt colleagues watching him differently, conversations stopping when he entered rooms, curious glances that suggested the rumor mill had already convicted him of impropriety regardless of what the investigation might conclude. Rachel remained supportive but cautious, offering friendship while maintaining enough distance to protect her own position. Other colleagues simply avoided him entirely, unwilling to risk association with someone whose career might soon implode spectacularly. Claire had it worse. The business press had somehow caught wind of an internal HR investigation involving the CEO, and while they lacked specific details, speculation ran rampant. Tech blogs published think pieces about power dynamics in corporate leadership. Competitors used the uncertainty to poach clients and employees. The board held emergency sessions to discuss crisis management strategies. And through it all, Claire maintained her professional composure with a strength that both inspired and devastated Ethan. They saw each other only in careful, strategic moments, brief conversations in empty conference rooms, texts sent from personal phones, one stolen weekend at Claire's apartment where they tried to pretend the outside world didn't exist. The isolation was brutal, transforming what should have been early relationship joy into a siege mentality where every moment together felt borrowed from an increasingly hostile future. The verdict arrived on a gray December morning via email from Sarah Morrison requesting their presence in her office at 2 p.m. No indication of findings, no preview of recommendations, just a sterile calendar invitation that carried the weight of impending judgment. Ethan spent the intervening hours in a state of controlled panic, his work forgotten, his attention fixed entirely on the approaching meeting. At 1:45, he left his desk and took the stairs to the fourth floor, needing the physical exertion to burn off nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm him. Claire was already waiting outside Sarah's office when Ethan arrived, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands betraying tension in the way she gripped her leather portfolio. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge each other beyond brief eye contact that communicated everything words couldn't. Sarah emerged precisely at 2 p.m. and ushered them into her office with professional courtesy that revealed nothing about what was coming. The corporate attorney was there again, along with two board members Ethan recognized from company presentations, Margaret Chen, the board chair, and David Foster, head of the audit committee. The presence of board members suggested this was more than a routine HR matter. This was a corporate decision that would have implications far beyond Ethan and Claire's personal relationship. "Thank you both for coming," Margaret said, taking control of the meeting with the authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "I'm sure you're eager to know the results of our investigation." "We are," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the stakes. Margaret nodded to Sarah, who opened a folder and began reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. "Our investigation examined the relationship between Ms. Reynolds and Mr. Walker across multiple dimensions, including the timeline of the relationship, any instances of favoritism or special treatment, communication patterns, and adherence to company policies regarding disclosure and conflicts of interest." Sarah paused, her expression softening slightly as she continued. "We found no evidence of policy violations. The relationship began outside of work contexts, was maintained separately from professional responsibilities, and was disclosed appropriately once the parties became aware it might create potential conflicts. We found no instances of preferential treatment, no exchange of confidential information, and no abuse of the power differential inherent in their respective positions." Ethan felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost painful. They'd done nothing wrong. The investigation had vindicated their careful separation of personal and professional, their determination to maintain integrity despite the complications, but Margaret's expression suggested the vindication was incomplete. "While the investigation found no policy violations," Margaret continued, "it did identify significant concerns about optics and potential conflicts of interest that could expose the company to future liability or reputational damage. Specifically, the relationship between a CEO and a subordinate employee, regardless of how carefully managed, creates an appearance of impropriety that could undermine stakeholder confidence and expose us to claims of favoritism from other employees. Claire's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The investigation found no actual impropriety, only the appearance of it. In corporate governance, appearance often matters as much as reality, David interjected. We have a fiduciary responsibility to protect shareholder value and company reputation. A romantic relationship between you and a subordinate employee creates risk that the board is uncomfortable accepting. So what are you recommending? Claire asked, her tone carefully controlled despite the anger Ethan could see simmering beneath. Margaret exchanged glances with David before responding. We're recommending that Mr. Walker be reassigned to a position that eliminates the reporting relationship and removes any appearance of conflict. Specifically, we'd like to offer him a lateral transfer to our Austin office, where he would assume a senior strategy role with comparable compensation and no direct or indirect reporting connection to you. The words landed like a physical blow. Austin. 1,500 miles away. A complete geographic separation that would effectively end the relationship by making it functionally impossible to maintain. That's not a remedy, Claire said, her control finally cracking. That's a punishment disguised as accommodation. You're forcing Ethan to choose between his career and his personal life. We're offering him a comparable position that addresses the conflict, Margaret corrected. Many employees would view a senior role in our Austin office as an advancement opportunity. And if I decline? Ethan asked, finding his voice despite the chaos in his chest. David's expression was sympathetic but firm. Then we'd need to explore other options. Different companies, potentially. We can provide excellent references and a severance package, but we cannot in good conscience maintain the current arrangement. Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the office. This is absurd. You found no evidence of wrongdoing. You acknowledged we've maintained complete professional boundaries, and now you're forcing a choice between career and relationship because you're concerned about optics? Ms. Reynolds, Margaret said calmly, please sit down. This isn't a punishment. It's a reasonable accommodation to address legitimate concerns. It's corporate cowardice, Claire shot back, but she sat anyway, her hands clenched into fists on the armrests. You're prioritizing appearance over substance. Perception over actual performance. And you're doing it because it's easier than defending the nuance of a complicated situation. We're doing it because we have responsibilities beyond your personal preferences, David replied. The board has a duty to protect the company, and right now, this relationship represents risk we're not willing to accept without mitigation. Ethan felt the conversation spiraling toward confrontation that would help no one. Can I have time to consider the Austin offer? He asked, interrupting the escalating tension. Margaret nodded, visibly relieved by the de-escalation. Of course, we'd like a response within a week. The position would begin in January, giving you time to relocate if you accept. And if Mr. Walker accepts the transfer, Claire said quietly, does the board have any further concerns about my continued leadership? The question hung heavy in the room, forcing Margaret and David to acknowledge the implicit threat they'd been making throughout the conversation. If Mr. Walker accepts the transfer and the conflict is eliminated, the board has no concerns about your leadership, Margaret confirmed. We believe you've demonstrated appropriate judgment in disclosing the relationship and cooperating with the investigation. Our concerns are about structure, not about your capabilities. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to receive, and Claire accepted it with a tight nod. The meeting concluded with forced pleasantries and logistical details about the Austin position. Ethan took the information packet mechanically, his mind already racing through impossible calculations. Austin meant abandoning everything he'd built in Chicago. Austin meant seeing Claire only on occasional weekends, conducting a long-distance relationship that would slowly suffocate under the weight of separation and inconvenience. Austin meant choosing career over love, safety over risk, and living with that choice for the rest of his life. He and Claire left HR separately, maintaining professional distance even as everything inside Ethan screamed to reach for her, to hold her, to promise that he'd find a solution that didn't require impossible sacrifices. They met that evening at Claire's apartment, the familiar space now feeling like a sanctuary under siege. Claire had changed from her business suit into jeans and a sweater, her CEO armor completely abandoned, leaving only the exhausted woman who'd spent 17 days watching her personal life dissected by corporate investigation. "I'm not going to Austin," Ethan said before Claire could speak. "I want you to know that. I'm not choosing a lateral transfer 1,500 miles away just to make the board comfortable." Claire looked at him with an expression that held both relief and despair. "Then what are you choosing? Because refusing Austin means leaving the company entirely, finding another job, starting over somewhere new. Is that really what you want?" "What I want is to be with you. Everything else is negotiable." "Ethan, you have a career. You've spent years building expertise and credibility. Walking away from Reynolds Tech because the board won't accommodate our relationship is but the right choice," Ethan interrupted. "For me. I'm not sacrificing what we have because some board members are uncomfortable with complexity. I'm not spending the next decade wondering what would have happened if I'd chosen courage over convenience." Claire moved to where he stood, her hands coming up to frame his face with a tenderness that made Ethan's chest ache. "You'd really leave? Give up everything you've built?" "I'd leave tomorrow if it meant keeping you." "And what if keeping me means I lose the company? What if the board decides that my judgment is too compromised, that my personal choices reflect poorly on my leadership capability? What if choosing you costs me everything I've spent 12 years building?" The question exposed the fundamental impossibility of their situation. Someone had to sacrifice. Someone had to choose between love and the professional identity they'd constructed, and the board had engineered the dilemma to ensure that whichever choice they made, the relationship would be the casualty. "Then we both walk away," Ethan said, the idea forming as he spoke. "You resign as CEO. I leave the company. We start something new together, without the constraints of corporate hierarchy or board oversight." Claire pulled back slightly, studying him with an intensity that felt like being seen at a molecular level. "You'd ask me to give up my company?" "I'd never ask that. But I'm saying if you wanted to walk away, if the cost of staying is too high, I'd walk with you. We'd figure out what comes next together." For a long moment, Claire said nothing. She moved to the window overlooking the city, her reflection ghostly in the glass, the lights of Chicago spreading below like possibilities waiting to be chosen. "I've spent my entire adult life proving I could build something that mattered," Claire said quietly. "Reynolds Tech is my legacy. It's proof that I could create systems that valued substance over performance, competence over politics. Walking away from that feels like admitting defeat, like letting the board's discomfort with my personal choices erase everything I've accomplished. Or it's choosing to define success differently," Ethan offered, "to prioritize what makes you human over what makes you powerful. Those shouldn't be mutually exclusive. They shouldn't be. But the board is making them exclusive, and we have to decide which matters more." Claire turned from the window, her expression resolute despite the tears tracking down her face. "I need time. A week, like the board requested. Time to think through all the implications, to explore whether there are options we haven't considered, to be certain about whatever choice we make." "Okay," Ethan agreed, though the idea of waiting another week felt unbearable. "But I need you to understand something," Claire continued. "Whatever we decide together. I'm not making choices about our future without your input, and you're not sacrificing your career to spare me difficult decisions. We're partners in this. Equal partners." "Equal partners," Ethan repeated, the words feeling like a promise. They spent the rest of the evening talking through scenarios and possibilities, trying to find some path forward that didn't require devastating loss. Claire considered negotiating with the board, proposing alternative accommodations that might address their concerns without geographic separation. Ethan researched employment opportunities at competing firms, discovering that his reputation made him marketable despite the complicated circumstances of his potential departure from Reynolds Tech. But every scenario came back to the same fundamental problem. As long as Claire remained CEO and Ethan remained employed at Reynolds Tech, the board would view their relationship as an unacceptable risk, and the board had enough power to make that risk intolerable for everyone involved. The week that followed was a study in sustained tension. Ethan went through the motions of work while quietly reaching out to contacts at other companies, testing the market without committing to anything. Claire attended board meetings and investor calls, performing her CEO role with the same excellence she'd always demonstrated while privately grappling with existential questions about identity and purpose. They saw each other every evening, the time together becoming both refuge and reminder of what they stood to lose. They didn't make love with the easy passion of their early relationship, but with an intensity that felt almost desperate, as though physical connection could somehow solve problems that required impossible choices. On Thursday evening, 3 days before Ethan's response to the Austin offer was due, Claire received an unexpected call from Margaret Chen. Ethan watched Claire's expression shift during the conversation, from wariness to confusion to something he couldn't quite identify. When Claire ended the call, she sat heavily on her couch, staring at her phone with an expression of stunned disbelief. "What happened?" Ethan asked. "Margaret wants to meet tomorrow. Just her and me, no other board members. She said she has a proposal she wants to discuss before the response deadline." Claire looked up at Ethan, her expression uncertain. She wouldn't give details, but she said she's been reconsidering the board's approach and wants to explore alternative solutions. "What kind of alternative solutions?" "I don't know. But the fact that she's reaching out suggests maybe there's flexibility we didn't realize existed." Hope felt dangerous after weeks of siege, but Ethan couldn't help the small spark that ignited in his chest. Maybe Margaret had recognized the absurdity of the board's position. Maybe she'd found some creative accommodation that addressed their concerns without requiring devastating sacrifice. Or maybe, and this seemed more likely, she had a different kind of ultimatum designed to force Claire's resignation without the messiness of an open confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory away from the office. Claire went alone, insisting that Ethan's presence might complicate whatever conversation Margaret wanted to have. So Ethan waited at his apartment, pacing and checking his phone compulsively, trying to distract himself with work he couldn't focus on while imagining every possible outcome. Claire returned 3 hours later, her expression impossible to read. She stood in Ethan's doorway looking simultaneously relieved and exhausted, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Margaret offered me a choice," Claire said without preamble. "A real choice, not the illusion the board presented last week." "What kind of choice?" Claire moved into the apartment and collapsed onto Ethan's couch, her energy visibly depleted. She admitted the board's position was too rigid, that forcing geographic separation or termination was an overreaction driven more by discomfort than actual risk management. She said several board members have been reconsidering, questioning whether they were prioritizing optics over substance. "So what's the alternative?" "They're willing to restructure my role. Keep me as CEO, but create a stronger executive team that provides additional oversight and accountability. They'd bring in a chief operating officer who would handle day-to-day operations, allowing me to focus on strategy and vision while creating separation between me and operational decisions that might affect your department." Ethan processed the proposal, looking for the catch. "And I stay in my current position?" "You'd actually be promoted. They want to create a vice president of strategic planning role, reporting to the new COO rather than to me. It eliminates the direct reporting relationship while acknowledging your capabilities and giving you more responsibility and compensation." It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. "What's the cost?" Claire's expression turned grim. "Complete transparency. Our relationship becomes public knowledge. No more privacy, no more separation between personal and professional. Everyone at the company will know, competitors will know. The business press will know, and we'll both be subject to ongoing scrutiny to ensure we're maintaining appropriate boundaries. So we trade privacy for permission." Essentially, yes. Margaret was very clear that this accommodation only works if we're willing to be completely open about the relationship and accept that people will judge us for it. She said the board can defend structural changes to address conflicts of interest, but they can't defend secrecy or the appearance of hiding something inappropriate. Ethan sat beside Claire, taking her hand with a grip that felt like an anchor in churning water. "How do you feel about that? About everyone knowing?" "Terrified," Claire admitted. "I've spent my entire career maintaining privacy about my personal life. The idea of becoming office gossip, of having our relationship discussed and dissected and reduced to scandal, it makes me want to walk away from everything. But Margaret also pointed out that hiding our relationship validates the idea that there's something wrong with it. That by insisting on privacy, we're implicitly agreeing with the board's original position that CEO-employee relationships are inherently inappropriate. Whereas being open about it, accepting scrutiny while demonstrating that we maintain professional integrity that challenges the assumption that power differentials automatically corrupt personal relationships. It was a compelling argument, and Ethan could see Claire responding to the intellectual framework even as she struggled with the emotional implications. "What do you want to do?" Ethan asked. Claire was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of Ethan's hand with unconscious gentleness. "I want to accept the proposal. I want to keep my company, see you promoted to a role you've earned, and stop hiding like we've done something wrong. But I need to know you're willing to face what comes with transparency. The gossip, the judgment, the constant scrutiny. Because once we make this choice, there's no going back to privacy." Ethan thought about the past 6 weeks. The careful separation, the stolen moments, the exhausting performance of pretending Claire was just his CEO rather than the woman he loved. He thought about Rachel's warning, the investigation's intrusion, the board's presumption that they could dictate the terms of his personal life, and he realized that privacy had never actually protected them. It had just delayed the inevitable reckoning while adding layers of deception that made everything harder. "I'm willing," Ethan said. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending that loving you is something I need to apologize for or compartmentalize. If being together means accepting scrutiny, then we accept scrutiny, and we prove through our actions that it's possible to maintain professional integrity while being honest about personal connection." Claire's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "You're sure? Because once we do this, your career becomes intertwined with mine. People will always wonder if you earned your position or if I gave it to you. Every success you have will be questioned, every promotion scrutinized. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's the reality we'll face." "I know," Ethan said. "And I'm choosing it anyway, because the alternative, losing you or living in permanent secrecy, is worse than any professional consequence I can imagine." Claire leaned forward and kissed him, the contact gentle and grateful and weighted with the magnitude of what they were choosing. When she pulled back, her expression held determination that Ethan recognized from boardroom presentations and strategic planning sessions. "Then I'm calling Margaret tomorrow and accepting the proposal," Claire said. "We make this official. We restructure the company to address the board's concerns. We promote you because you've earned it, not because of our relationship. And we face whatever comes next with honesty instead of hiding." "Together," Ethan added. "Together," Claire confirmed. That night they made plans with the careful detail of people who'd learned that good intentions weren't enough without strategic execution. Claire would draft a company-wide announcement explaining the restructuring and acknowledging her relationship with Ethan, making it clear that the changes were designed to maintain professional integrity while respecting personal autonomy. Ethan would prepare for his new role, documenting his qualifications and achievements to preempt any suggestion that the promotion was favoritism rather than earned advancement. They anticipated the gossip, the speculation, the inevitable assumptions that would reduce their relationship to scandal regardless of the structural safeguards they implemented. And they committed to proving, through consistent professional excellence and maintained boundaries, that it was possible to be both transparent and appropriate, both personally connected and professionally ethical. On Monday morning, Claire sent the company-wide announcement. The email was brief, direct, and uncompromising in its honesty. She explained the new executive structure, introduced the incoming COO who would handle operational leadership, announced Ethan's promotion to VP of Strategic Planning, and acknowledged that she and Ethan were in a personal relationship that had been fully disclosed and appropriately addressed through restructuring. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Ethan's inbox flooded with messages ranging from supportive to incredulous to openly hostile. Rachel sent a text that simply said, "Well, you certainly picked the dramatic option." The break room conversation stopped whenever Ethan entered. Colleagues who'd been friendly became distant, their discomfort with the situation obvious despite their attempts at professionalism. But there were also unexpected moments of support. Sarah Morrison from HR stopped by Ethan's desk to congratulate him on the promotion and acknowledge the courage it took to be transparent about the relationship. Several colleagues from the strategy department sent notes expressing respect for how he and Claire had handled an impossible situation. And slowly, grudgingly, the gossip began to shift from scandal to acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, Two adults could navigate complex professional and personal dynamics with integrity. Claire faced her own reckoning. The business press ran stories questioning her judgment, speculating about whether the relationship compromised her leadership effectiveness, debating whether CEOs should be allowed to date employees regardless of structural safeguards. Competitors used the controversy to suggest instability at Reynolds Tech. Some investors expressed concerns during quarterly calls. But Claire handled it with the same strategic excellence she brought to everything else. She addressed concerns directly, acknowledged the legitimate questions about power dynamics, and demonstrated through continued company performance that her personal life had no impact on her professional capabilities. And slowly, the narrative began to shift from scandal to a more nuanced conversation about modern workplace relationships, power dynamics, and the possibility of maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging personal humanity. 3 weeks after the announcement, Ethan settled into his new role with a mixture of relief and residual anxiety. The promotion was legitimate. He'd earned it through years of solid work and strategic thinking that predated his relationship with Claire. But he knew some colleagues would always question it, would always wonder if he'd leveraged personal connection for professional advancement. He and Claire maintained scrupulous boundaries at work. They didn't meet privately in the office. They didn't exchange personal communications during business hours. They participated in meetings together only when necessary and treated each other with the same professional courtesy they extended to any colleague. It was exhausting and sometimes felt absurd, but it was necessary to demonstrate that the structural safeguards were real rather than performative. Outside work, they built something that felt increasingly solid and real. They had dinner together most evenings, spent weekends exploring Chicago neighborhoods they'd never visited before, had ordinary arguments about dishes and laundry and whose turn it was to pick the movie. The relationship that had begun at a wedding reception with a whispered challenge had become something wonderfully, terrifyingly normal. The normalcy lasted exactly 4 months before reality delivered its next challenge, this time from a direction neither of them anticipated. Ethan was reviewing quarterly projections on a Tuesday afternoon in March when his phone buzzed with a text from Claire that contained only 3 words and a time. "My office, now." The terseness was unusual enough to trigger immediate concern. Ethan closed his laptop and walked to the executive floor with a growing sense of unease that intensified when he found Claire's assistant conspicuously absent and her office door closed. He knocked once and entered to find Claire standing by her window, her posture rigid with a tension that suggested whatever had happened was serious enough to crack her usual composure. "Close the door," Claire said without turning around. Ethan obeyed, his stomach already churning with scenarios ranging from company crisis to personal catastrophe. "What's wrong?" Claire turned to face him, and Ethan saw immediately that she'd been crying. Not dramatically, but enough that her eyes were red and her carefully applied makeup had smudged slightly at the corners. "I got a call from David Foster an hour ago," Claire said, her voice steady despite the visible emotion. "He wanted to give me advance warning before the board meeting tomorrow. They're bringing a formal vote to remove me as CEO." The words hit like a physical blow. "On what grounds?" "Poor judgment, compromised leadership, creating unnecessary controversy that's damaged company reputation and shareholder value." Claire's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Apparently our transparency didn't satisfy them. They've decided that any CEO who dates an employee, regardless of structural safeguards, demonstrates fundamentally flawed decision-making that warrants removal. But the restructuring, the promotion, they approved all of it." "They approved it as a test," Claire said, "a way to see if the controversy would die down or escalate. And according to David, enough board members believe the ongoing attention to our relationship is damaging enough to warrant leadership change." Ethan felt rage building in his chest, hot and acidic. "This is absurd. Company performance has been excellent. You've exceeded every metric they care about. The only thing that's changed is that you're in a relationship they find uncomfortable." "Welcome to corporate governance," Claire replied, "where perception matters more than performance and personal choices become evidence of professional inadequacy. What happens if they vote to remove you?" Claire moved away from the window and sank into her desk chair, suddenly looking exhausted in a way Ethan had never seen. "They install an interim CEO while conducting a search for permanent replacement. I'd likely be offered a severance package and a carefully worded press release about pursuing other opportunities. And Reynolds Tech, the company I built from nothing, would continue without me. We fight this, Ethan said immediately. We make them justify the removal publicly. We force them to admit they're firing you because you fell in love, not because of any actual performance failure. And if we fight and lose, I leave anyway, but without the severance or the carefully managed narrative. I become a cautionary tale about CEOs who let personal relationships compromise their judgment. Claire rubbed her eyes tiredly. I've been running scenarios all afternoon, Ethan. Every path forward has devastating consequences. Not every path. Ethan pulled a chair close to Claire's desk and leaned forward with an intensity that demanded her attention. You walk away before they can vote. You resign on your own terms, with your dignity intact, and you make it clear you're leaving because the board's position is untenable, not because their concerns are legitimate. That's still losing. It's choosing how you lose, like Ethan corrected, controlling the narrative instead of letting them write it for you. Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting from despair to something more calculated. If I resign, I could make a statement, not just about my specific situation, but about the broader issues of how corporations treat leaders who refuse to separate their humanity from their professional roles. You could change the conversation, Ethan agreed. Transform this from scandal about a CEO's poor judgment into a critique of corporate structures that punish transparency and penalize honesty. It would be risky. I'd be burning bridges with the board, possibly making myself radioactive to other companies who see me as difficult or unwilling to prioritize corporate needs over personal preferences. Or you'd be positioning yourself as someone with principles worth defending, someone who chose integrity over expedience. Claire was quiet for several minutes, her fingers drumming against her desk in the unconscious pattern Ethan recognized as her thinking through complex problems. Finally, she looked up with an expression that held both resignation and determination. If I do this, if I resign before the vote, I need you to promise me something. Anything. You stay at Reynolds Tech. You keep your position. You continue building your career. You don't sacrifice everything you've worked for because I chose to walk away. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Claire raised her hand to stop him. I'm serious, Ethan. If we both leave, it validates the board's position that our relationship was inappropriate enough to warrant mutual professional destruction. But if you stay and continue demonstrating excellence, you prove that the problem wasn't the relationship. It was the board's inability to accept complexity. You want me to work for the people who forced you out? I want you to prove they were wrong about you, Claire corrected. I want you to succeed so spectacularly that every assumption they made about our relationship becomes obviously absurd. And what about us? What happens to our relationship if you're no longer CEO and I'm still working at Reynolds Tech? Claire's expression softened, some of the professional calculation giving way to genuine emotion. Then we stop being a corporate scandal and start being just two people who love each other. No power dynamics, no board oversight, no scrutiny beyond normal relationship complications. We get to be ordinary, Ethan. Isn't that what we wanted? The question hung between them, exposing a truth they'd both been avoiding. The corporate drama had consumed so much energy that they'd almost forgotten what had drawn them together in the first place. Not power or status or professional advancement, but simple human connection. The whispered words during a wedding ceremony. The honest conversation over Italian food. The recognition that being seen as a person rather than a position was worth any professional cost. I don't want you to leave your company, Ethan said quietly. I don't want you to lose what you built because the board can't handle complexity. I know. But sometimes the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving. And I think we've reached that point. Claire drafted her resignation that evening at Ethan's apartment, sitting at his kitchen table with her laptop while he made dinner neither of them would eat. The letter was brief and precise, acknowledging her decision to resign effective immediately while making clear the board's impossible position had left her no acceptable alternative. She didn't name Ethan specifically, but referenced the personal relationship that had become the focus of board concern, and she stated unequivocally that structural safeguards had been appropriate and effective, but ultimately insufficient to address board members' discomfort with the CEO who refused to separate personal humanity from professional responsibility. It's good, Ethan said after reading the draft. Clear, principled, and impossible to misinterpret. It's also a grenade I'm throwing into the boardroom, Claire replied. Once I send this, there's no walking it back. No negotiation, no compromise, just consequences. Are you ready for those consequences? Claire closed her laptop with deliberate finality. I've been ready since the wedding. I just didn't realize it yet. She submitted the resignation at midnight, emailing it directly to Margaret Chen with copies to all board members and Sarah Morrison in HR. Then she turned off her phone, poured 2 glasses of wine, and settled onto Ethan's couch with the exhausted relief of someone who'd finally stopped fighting an unwinnable battle. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now we wait for the chaos, Claire said. The board will scramble to manage the narrative. They'll probably try to frame my resignation as mutual agreement rather than forced departure. They'll announce a search for permanent CEO while installing someone interim, and they'll very carefully avoid admitting that they pushed out a successful leader because she fell in love. Will you tell the real story? Eventually, when the dust settles and I've had time to process everything. Right now, I just want to sit here with you and remember why I made this choice. The chaos Claire predicted arrived with dawn. Her phone, turned back on out of necessity, exploded with calls and messages. The board wanted emergency meetings. HR needed exit interviews. The executive team demanded clarity about transition plans. And the media, somehow already aware of the resignation, wanted statements and interviews and insider perspectives on the shocking departure of Reynolds Tech's founding CEO. Claire handled it all with the same professional excellence she'd always demonstrated, even as she was actively leaving the company that had defined her adult identity. She met with the executive team to ensure smooth transition. She conducted the required exit interviews with grace and restraint. She even participated in the carefully scripted press release that presented her departure as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities rather than the forced resignation it actually was. But she also began laying groundwork for a different narrative. She reached out to trusted business journalists with background information about the board's concerns and the impossible position they'd created. She spoke confidentially with industry peers about the broader issues of how corporations handle executive relationships and personal autonomy. And she started planning what would come next, not just for her career, but for the larger conversation about leadership, humanity, and the cost of transparency in corporate environments. Ethan, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning at Reynolds Tech. The resignation sent shockwaves through the company, and everyone knew the real reason behind Claire's departure, even if the official narrative pretended otherwise. Colleagues approached him with expressions ranging from sympathy to suspicion, some offering support while others clearly blamed him for the CEO's exit. Rachel cornered him in the break room on Claire's 3rd day of terminal leave, her expression serious. People are saying you should resign too, that staying after what happened to Claire makes you complicit with the board's decision. People can say whatever they want, Ethan replied, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly despite his attempt at composure. I'm staying because Claire asked me to, because walking away would validate the board's position that our relationship was inappropriate enough to warrant mutual professional destruction. And you're okay being the person who kept his job while his girlfriend got forced out? I'm not okay with any of this, Ethan admitted, but I trust Claire's judgment. She said staying and succeeding proves the board wrong about me. So that's what I'm doing. That's going to be a lonely position. Probably, but it's the right one. Rachel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think you're brave. Stupid, maybe, but brave. I'll take it. The interim CEO who replaced Claire was a board member named Thomas Wright, a competent but uninspiring executive who'd built his career through careful risk avoidance and political maneuvering rather than innovation or vision. He called an all-hands meeting his first week to reassure employees that Reynolds Tech's mission and values remained unchanged despite leadership transition. Ethan sat in the back of the crowded auditorium and listened to Thomas deliver platitudes about continuity and stability, and he felt rage building in his chest at the fundamental dishonesty of the performance. Claire had built this company on principles of transparency and valuing substance over performance, and the board had replaced her with someone whose primary qualification was his willingness to prioritize corporate comfort over authentic leadership. After the meeting, Ethan returned to his office and drafted an email he'd been composing mentally for days. It was addressed to the entire executive team and key department heads, and it laid out a proposal for a company-wide initiative focused on relationship policies and power dynamics in corporate environments. The proposal was carefully framed around business objectives, improving retention, enhancing workplace culture, reducing legal liability from unclear relationship policies. But the underlying message was impossible to miss. Ethan was proposing that Reynolds Tech conduct a comprehensive review of how they handled personal relationships between employees at different hierarchical levels, with explicit examination of whether current policies prioritized appearance over substance, and whether they created environments where transparency was punished rather than rewarded. It was professional and strategic, and absolutely designed to force conversation about the exact issues that had led to Claire's resignation. He sent the email before he could second-guess himself, then sat back and waited for the inevitable response. Thomas Wright called him within an hour, his tone carefully neutral. "Ethan, I've reviewed your proposal. It's provocative." "It's necessary," Ethan corrected. "We just lost our founding CEO over relationship policy concerns. If we don't examine those policies critically, we're guaranteeing the same issues will arise again. The board may view this proposal as inappropriate given your personal involvement in the situation. The board can view it however they want, but the proposal stands on its merits regardless of my personal circumstances. And if they're unwilling to consider it because of who's proposing it, that says more about their limitations than mine." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his tone slightly warmer. "I'll present it to the board. No promises about their response, but I'll make sure they see it. That's all I'm asking." The board's response came 2 weeks later in the form of a carefully worded rejection that praised Ethan's initiative while explaining that current policies were adequate and comprehensive review wasn't warranted at this time. It was corporate speak for, "We're not interested in examining our own failures," and Ethan wasn't surprised. But he'd accomplished what he'd intended. The proposal had forced conversation about the real reasons for Claire's departure. It had put the board on record as refusing to examine policies that had cost them their most successful CEO. And it had established Ethan as someone willing to challenge comfortable narratives even when doing so was professionally risky. Rachel sent him a text after the board's rejection was circulated. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I haven't decided which." Ethan smiled and typed his response. "Why can't it be both?" 3 months after Claire's resignation, Ethan was working late when his office phone rang with an internal extension he didn't recognize. He answered to find Margaret Chen on the other end, her tone unexpectedly warm. "Ethan, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to discuss something with you." They met in a small conference room far from executive offices, the location choice suggesting Margaret wanted privacy. She arrived carrying a folder that she set on the table between them with deliberate care. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said without preamble. "The board made a mistake with Claire. We let discomfort with complexity override our responsibility to support excellent leadership, and we lost someone irreplaceable as a result." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond, so he said nothing and waited for Margaret to continue. "I've spent the past 3 months watching Thomas try to fill Claire's shoes, and it's become increasingly obvious that we downgraded significantly. Not because Thomas is incompetent, but because Claire brought something exceptional that we took for granted until it was gone." Margaret opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "I've been talking with several other board members, and we want to extend an offer to Claire to return as CEO with a revised relationship policy that explicitly permits personal relationships between executives and employees as long as appropriate structural safeguards are in place." Ethan stared at the document without touching it. "You want Claire back?" "We want to correct our mistake," Margaret said, "and we're hoping you'll help us make that case to her." "Why would she come back? You forced her out because she refused to choose between her personal life and her professional identity. Why would she trust you not to do the same thing again when the next complicated situation arises?" "Because we're putting it in writing," Margaret replied. "The revised policy isn't just verbal assurance. It's a formal board resolution that explicitly states personal relationships between employees at different hierarchical levels are permissible as long as they're disclosed and appropriate structural safeguards are implemented. Claire's relationship with you would be explicitly protected, documented, and defended by board policy. And what changed? Why are you willing to do this now when you weren't 4 months ago? Margaret's expression turned rueful. Because we realized our mistake. Because competitors are using Claire's departure to suggest instability at Reynolds Tech. Because employees are leaving for companies with more progressive relationship policies. And because, honestly, I've come to believe we were wrong. That prioritizing appearance over substance was a failure of leadership on our part, not Claire's. Ethan picked up the document and skimmed the formal language that translated Margaret's explanation into legal policy. It was comprehensive and appeared genuine, though his cynicism about board motives made him cautious about accepting anything at face value. "I'll talk to Claire," Ethan said finally, "but I can't promise she'll be interested. You hurt her. You made her question 12 years of work and sacrifice. That's not something a policy revision erases." "I know," Margaret said quietly, "but I'm hoping she'll at least consider it. Reynolds Tech needs her, and I think, though I could be wrong, she needs Reynolds Tech too." Ethan brought the proposal to Claire that evening, finding her in the home office she'd set up in a spare bedroom of her apartment. She'd been consulting for several companies since her resignation, leveraging her expertise while deciding what came next, and she seemed genuinely content in ways she hadn't been during her final months as CEO. "The board wants you back," Ethan said, handing her the folder, "with a formal policy revision that protects our relationship." Claire read through the document with the careful attention she gave everything, her expression revealing nothing until she finally set it down and looked at Ethan with eyes that held equal parts skepticism and something that might have been longing. "They want me back now that they've realized I wasn't easily replaced," Claire said, "not because they actually believe they were wrong, but because my absence is creating problems they didn't anticipate." "Does it matter why they want you back if the policy revision is genuine?" "It matters to me. I don't want to return just to fix problems they created by forcing me out. I want to return, if I return, because they've genuinely reconsidered their position on leadership and humanity. So, talk to Margaret, hear what she has to say, and then decide based on whether you believe she's sincere." Claire was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the policy document with unconscious precision. "If I go back, nothing will be the same. I'll always know the board can withdraw support if I make choices they find uncomfortable. I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next impossible situation will arise. Or you'll have established that you won't be forced out for being human, that you can make personal choices without sacrificing professional credibility. That transparency and structural safeguards actually work when combined with leadership that refuses to apologize for complexity. You're very good at reframing defeat as victory. I learned from the best." Claire smiled despite herself, then pulled Ethan close with a gentleness that felt like both question and answer. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to do whatever makes you happy. If that's returning to Reynolds Tech and reclaiming the company you built, I support that completely. If it's staying independent and building something new without board oversight, I support that too. I just want you to choose based on what you want, not on what you think you should want or what other people expect." "And what about you? What happens to your position if I return as CEO?" "The policy revision explicitly allows our relationship. The structural safeguards we implemented are still in place. Nothing changes professionally except that we stop pretending there's something wrong with a CEO and a VP being in a relationship as long as they maintain appropriate boundaries." "Nothing changes except everything," Claire said softly. "Because if I return, we're making a statement that we refuse to let corporate discomfort dictate our personal choices, that we're willing to be visible and vulnerable and subject to ongoing scrutiny because the alternative, hiding or separating, is worse than any professional consequence." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "That's exactly what we're doing." Claire met with Margaret 3 days later at the same coffee shop where they'd discussed alternatives before Claire's resignation. Ethan wasn't present for the conversation, but Claire recounted it that evening with a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. "Margaret apologized," Claire said. "Really apologized. Not the corporate non-apology where someone regrets that you feel hurt, but actual acknowledgement that the board made a mistake and caused real harm. She said she's been thinking a lot about leadership and humanity, about how corporations claim to value whole persons while punishing any deviation from narrow professional identities. And she said, watching me leave made her realize how much potential the company loses when leaders are forced to choose between authenticity and acceptance. Do you believe her? I think I do, Claire said slowly. She seemed genuinely reflective rather than just strategically accommodating. And the policy revision isn't just about me and you, it's a broader framework for how Reynolds Tech handles all relationship disclosures going forward. It's institutional change, not just individual exception. So what did you tell her? That I'd think about it. That I needed time to consider whether returning was the right choice or just the familiar one. Claire looked at Ethan with an expression that held both vulnerability and determination. What do you think I should do? Ethan had thought carefully about this question, knowing Claire would ask it and wanting to provide an answer that was honest without being prescriptive. I think you built something extraordinary at Reynolds Tech, something that challenged conventional corporate assumptions and proved that substance could matter more than performance. And I think walking away permanently because the board temporarily lost sight of those values means they win. They get to replace what you built with something safer and less challenging. But if you return with explicit protection for the principles you care about, you reclaim not just the company, but the possibility that corporations can actually evolve beyond narrow definitions of appropriate leadership. That's a very strategic answer. You asked what I think, not what I feel. Okay, what do you feel? Ethan pulled Claire into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that communicated everything words couldn't. I feel like you deserve to lead the company you built. I feel like the board doesn't deserve your brilliance after how they treated you. And I feel like whatever you decide, I'm with you completely. No reservations, no conditions, just partnership. Claire buried her face against Ethan's chest, and he felt her shoulders shake with emotion she rarely allowed herself to express. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled but clear. I want to go back. Not because they want me, but because I want to prove that leaving was a mistake. Theirs, not mine. I want to demonstrate that leadership and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. And I want to build the kind of company where other people don't have to make the impossible choices we faced. Then go back, Ethan said simply. Reclaim what's yours. Claire returned to Reynolds Tech 6 weeks later, amid carefully orchestrated announcements and strategic messaging. The board framed her return as evidence of their commitment to progressive leadership policies. Claire positioned it as an opportunity to implement institutional changes that protected employee autonomy while maintaining professional standards. And the business press, somewhat surprisingly, treated it as a case study in corporate evolution and the changing nature of workplace relationships. Ethan watched from the audience as Claire addressed the all-hands meeting on her first day back, her presence commanding the room with the same excellence he remembered from before her resignation. She talked about the past 6 months with remarkable honesty, acknowledging the board's initial resistance to her relationship with Ethan, her decision to resign rather than accept untenable conditions, and the institutional changes that had made her return possible. I'm not here because the board realized they made a mistake, Claire said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded auditorium. I'm here because we collectively decided that corporations can be better than they traditionally have been, that we can value whole persons rather than demanding employees fragment themselves into acceptable professional personas, that transparency and appropriate boundaries can coexist, and that leadership requires the courage to challenge comfortable assumptions about what's possible. The applause was genuine and sustained, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Claire's resignation. She was back. They were both here. And the company that had nearly destroyed itself trying to punish their relationship was now defending it as evidence of progressive values. It was absurd and imperfect and absolutely worth every impossible choice they'd made. Life settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and transformed. Claire resumed her CEO responsibilities with renewed energy, implementing relationship policies across the company that protected disclosure while preventing retaliation. Ethan continued building his career without the shadow of impropriety that had haunted his promotion, proving through consistent excellence that his position was earned rather than gifted. They maintained scrupulous professional boundaries at work. No private meetings in Claire's office, no personal communications during business hours, clear separation between their professional and personal roles. But outside work, they built something that felt increasingly permanent and real. 6 months after Claire's return, Ethan came home from work to find her sitting on his couch with an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for him with something important to discuss. "We need to talk about where this is going," Claire said without preamble. Ethan felt his stomach drop, the words triggering immediate anxiety despite everything they'd survived together. "Okay, where's this going?" Claire stood and crossed to where he'd frozen just inside the doorway, taking his hands with a gentleness that eased some of his panic. "I'm 42 years old. I've spent my entire adult life building a company and avoiding personal commitments because I was afraid they'd compromise my professional identity. But being with you has taught me that the things I was afraid of, vulnerability, dependence, choosing another person over complete autonomy, those aren't weaknesses. They're just different kinds of strength." "Claire, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stop calling this dating or a relationship or whatever careful language we use to avoid committing to something permanent. I want marriage, Ethan. I want the public declaration that we're choosing each other not just despite complications, but because of them. I want to stand in front of people and promise forever the way Amanda and her husband did at that wedding where this all started." Ethan felt tears burning behind his eyes as the full meaning of Claire's words landed. "Are you proposing to me?" "I am. And before you answer, I need you to understand what you'd be signing up for. You'd be marrying your CEO, which means ongoing scrutiny and judgment about power dynamics. You'd be marrying someone whose work will always demand significant time and energy. You'd be marrying someone who's complicated and difficult and not very good at the traditional relationship compromises people expect." "I know exactly who I'd be marrying," Ethan interrupted. "The woman who whispered something dangerous during a wedding ceremony and changed my entire life. The woman who chose transparency over safety and integrity over expedience. The woman who makes me feel seen as a person rather than a position. So, yes, Claire Reynolds, I will absolutely marry you." Claire kissed him with an intensity that suggested relief and joy in equal measure, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears. She didn't bother hiding. "I don't have a ring," she admitted. "I didn't plan this. I just realized this afternoon that I didn't want to wait anymore. That every day without being married to you felt like time wasted pretending to be more cautious than I actually feel." "We'll get rings," Ethan said. "We'll plan a wedding. We'll do all the traditional things. But right now, in this moment, the only thing that matters is that we both said yes." They were married 4 months later in a small ceremony that deliberately echoed the wedding where they'd met. The venue was different, a botanical garden instead of a waterfront estate, but the intimate gathering of close friends and family felt spiritually similar to that October evening when Claire had leaned close and challenged Ethan to see her instead of the bride. Rachel served as Ethan's witness, her toast at the reception focusing on the courage it took to choose love over safety, and the beauty of watching two people refuse to let corporate expectations dictate personal choices. Margaret Chen attended as Claire's guest, her presence a tacit acknowledgement of the board's evolution and perhaps her own. Sarah Morrison from HR sent flowers with a card that simply said, "Congratulations on building something that challenged all my assumptions about workplace relationships." But the moment that mattered most came during the ceremony itself, when the officiant asked if they had vows they'd written. Claire went first, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her expression. "Ethan, you saw me when I'd forgotten how to be seen. You valued my humanity when I'd reduced myself to a position and a title. You challenged me to be brave enough to want ordinary happiness instead of just extraordinary achievement. I'm standing here today not because it was easy or convenient, but because choosing you, choosing us, was the most important decision I've ever made. And I promise to keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." Ethan's vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "Claire, from the moment you told me to stop looking at the bride and look at you instead, I've been learning what it means to really see another person, to recognize complexity without trying to simplify it, to embrace difficulty without running from it. You've taught me that the most important choices are often the hardest ones, and that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing what matters despite fear. I promise to be your partner in every sense of that word, to support your ambitions while pursuing my own, to maintain boundaries that protect us while refusing to hide what we've built, to love you not despite your complications but because of them." When they kissed to seal the promises, Ethan heard applause and saw smiles through tears that suggested their small audience understood the weight of what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a declaration that love could survive corporate scrutiny, that transparency could coexist with professional success, and that two people willing to fight for each other could reshape the very systems designed to keep them apart. The reception was joyful and relaxed, full of laughter and dancing, and the kind of genuine celebration that comes when people have survived something difficult together. Near the end of the evening, as guests began departing and the venue staff started cleanup, Claire pulled Ethan onto the empty dance floor for one final slow dance.
"Do you remember what I said that night at the wedding?" Claire asked, her head resting against Ethan's chest. "When we were on the terrace and I told you we had to move forward carefully? I remember everything from that night. I was so afraid. Afraid of what wanting you would cost me, afraid of losing control, afraid that choosing personal happiness would somehow diminish everything I'd built professionally. And now?" Claire lifted her head to look at him, her expression holding contentment that seemed almost unfamiliar on her usually intense features. "Now I know that the things I was afraid of losing were things I needed to let go of anyway. The performance, the perfect control, the belief that professional success required personal sacrifice. You didn't diminish what I built. You helped me understand that I'm more than what I've built, and that's worth every difficult choice we made." They swayed together in comfortable silence, two people who'd started as CEO and strategist, become scandal and controversy, survived investigation and forced resignation, and emerged as partners who'd proven that love and leadership could coexist if you were brave enough to demand both. "I'm glad you told me to stop looking at the bride," Ethan said quietly. Claire smiled against his chest. "So am I. Best reckless decision I ever made." "Second best," Ethan corrected. "The best was saying yes when I asked you to marry me." "You didn't ask. I proposed to you." "Details." Claire laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded, and Ethan felt a contentment settle over him that had nothing to do with professional success or corporate vindication. This was about the ordinary miracle of finding someone who made you feel fully human, fully seen, fully yourself. Everything else, the promotions and policies and public declarations, those were just the scaffolding that supported what really mattered. They'd built something real, something that survived scrutiny and challenge and every institutional force designed to make them choose between love and achievement. And they'd done it by refusing to pretend they were anything other than what they were. Two complicated people who'd chosen each other despite every logical reason to walk away. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, Ethan came home from work to find Claire cooking dinner with music playing and a contentment in her movements that suggested she'd finally found peace with the balance between professional excellence and personal joy. She looked up when he entered, her smile immediate and warm, and Ethan was struck by how different this moment felt from those early days of careful compartmentalization and hidden connection. "How was your day?" Claire asked, the question mundane but weighted with genuine interest. "Good, productive." Thomas complimented the strategic framework I presented in the executive meeting, said it demonstrated exactly the kind of clear thinking that justifies my promotion. "He's right. You're exceptional at what you do." Coming from my CEO wife, that's either a compliment or a conflict of interest. Claire laughed and crossed the kitchen to kiss him, the casual intimacy of the gesture evidence of how far they'd traveled from those first careful boundaries. "It's both. And I'm allowed to acknowledge your excellence even if it creates awkward optics. The board would probably prefer you didn't. The board has learned to accept that I'm going to prioritize substance over appearance. They'll adjust." They ate dinner and talked about ordinary things, upcoming meetings, weekend plans, the frustrating traffic that had made Claire's commute 20 minutes longer than usual. It was domestic and unremarkable and absolutely perfect in its normalcy. Later, lying in bed with Claire's breathing evening out as sleep claimed her, Ethan thought about the wedding invitation that had arrived months ago, the one he'd almost thrown away without opening. That single decision to RSVP yes to a peripheral connection celebration had set in motion everything that followed. The whispered challenge during a ceremony, the dangerous attraction, the investigation and resignation and corporate battle that had tested every assumption about what relationships could look like in professional contexts. He thought about Claire's question from their wedding day,
about whether she was a person or always the CEO. And he realized the answer was that she was both, complicated and brilliant and difficult and extraordinary, and that loving her meant accepting all of it without trying to simplify or compartmentalize. They'd chosen each other. They'd survived corporate scrutiny. They'd proven that transparency and boundaries could coexist, that leadership and humanity weren't mutually exclusive, that two people willing to fight for what mattered could reshape systems designed to keep them apart. And now they had this: ordinary evenings and shared routines and the quiet miracle of partnership built on honesty rather than performance. It wasn't the story either of them expected. It certainly wasn't simple or convenient, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made every impossible choice absolutely worth it. Claire stirred slightly in her sleep, unconsciously moving closer, and Ethan wrapped his arm around her with a contentment that required no words. They'd built something that survived everything thrown at it. They'd chosen courage over comfort, transparency over safety, love over expedience. And they'd do it again, every single time, without hesitation or regret. Because some things, some people, are worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth choosing, publicly and irrevocably, despite every logical reason to walk away. Claire Reynolds had taught him that, and Ethan Walker had reminded her. Together, they'd proven it was possible to have both professional excellence and personal joy, both leadership and love, both achievement and authentic connection. They'd stopped looking at what they were supposed to want and looked at each other instead. And everything had changed.